Welcome my beloved student, how you doing? Hope you all are doing great and lovely. In this video we are gonna see, what if Deku had spirit infusing quirk, this is movie. And for more amazing content leave a like, share and subscribe. And I wanna thank the author of this story named A Sheep Among Dragons by The Adventurer 0815. Also the author make awesome arts. Here are some example. So do check out and leave kudos. Let's get in the video. Inko had one hell of a day thus far. It had all started when Hisashi had decided to turn up on her doorstep, demanding of her to let him stay because their apartment effectively belonged to him. Inko had fought with him over him being a deadbeat dad for the whole 12 years of her son's still young life, eventually drew the short straw and decided to pack their things and leave to live with her aunt out on the countryside for a while. On the way there, the engine of her car had stalled, which had left Izuku and her stranded in the middle of nowhere. Up until this point, she might have been unlucky, but at least events had still been somewhat normal. The second the two of them had stumbled across the ghost town inhabited by actual ghosts was when things really began to get weird. Just when she thought it couldn't possibly get any worse, she had gotten turned into a sheep, ended up caught in a fight between two dragons, had been forced to watch one of them take off with her son, and got knocked out of the sky along with the other. Needless to say, it took her a while to get her bearings. She was still dizzy from being shaken around, while the two dragons had coiled and twisted around each other in midair. Being in a sheep's body didn't help, either. The feeling of wrongness, of being wrapped in wool, of her limbs bending at odd angles, her fingers being unable to move while her ears moved too much, was causing her a grade of discomfort. And yet no amount of discomfort could keep a parent down for long when their child was missing and in danger. Inko shook and blinked the dizziness away, and the traditionally built mansion she had glimpsed from above came into view. Except that one half of it had given way and caved in when the huge golden dragon had crash-landed on it. She imagined she had tumbled out of its claws like a ball of yarn. She certainly felt like one. Shakily, she pushed herself up from the grey rocks and dead grass that surrounded the mansion. Step by wobbly step, Inko made her way over to the still intact part of the mansion's porch. She could have sworn the dragon that had tried to save Izuku and her earlier had been so large that he'd be impossible to miss, but for some reason, she couldn't spot him between the rubble. Maybe because she was even shorter than usual now. She also didn't feel particularly comfortable or sane, for that matter, seeking a dragon for answers, but beggars can't be chooser and all that. Besides, the dragon had said something about wanting to help them when he'd swept them up, and he had radiated a strange aura that had made her feel warm and comfortable, like lying on the warm earth and basking in the sun on a summer's day. It had lasted only for a moment in flight, but it certainly had made the dragon seem far more trustworthy than the white and red coiling monster that had come after them, demanding Izuku like her son was his possession. Something stirred among the rubble and Inko froze in place. There was a dragon there, all right. But a much smaller one, maybe only as long as a bus or a train wagon, and as tall as a grown man. His legs seemed to be studded in yellow scales, while a layer of short white fur covered his body, save for the pink and gnarled scar tissue that stretched all across the left side of his chest and stomach. It was quite the unpleasant sight, much like the dragon's overall state of health. Unlike the powerful, divine creature that had tried to save Izuku, this one looked malnourished. There was not a gram of either muscle or fat on him, just plenty of bones visible. Groaning, the dragon raised his head out of a pile of broken shingles. His cheeks were hollow, eyes, but two pinpricks of blue shining from overshadowed eye sockets, and his left horn had broken off. His blonde mane looked matted and disheveled, just like the tuft at the end of his tail. The tip of which was also bent in a way that indicated a dislocated vertebra. Cautiously, Inko stepped behind a still intact wooden pillar while the dragon scrambled out of the debris. "Oh. You're still here?" the dragon asked in a deep, somewhat raspy voice. "That's strange. When they've been turned into cattle, usually they flee the first chance they get. Maybe she got injured. He's seen her. Curse this sheep body." Her backside must have stuck out from behind the pillar. Plucking up her courage, she peeked out at the dragon, who was approaching her slowly. She wasn't quite sure if he was just trying not to startle her or sneaking up on her to pounce. "Ah, please, don't." Inko startled herself with the bleeding, still unused to her newfound disability to form words. The dragon tilted his head at her, pointed ears flicking forward. "What? Eat you? Don't worry. I don't have a habit of eating humans. Or anything that can take human form." He smiled broadly at her, rows of sharp teeth glinting in the light of the setting sun. She took a step forward. "Bah, you can understand me?" "Wait a minute," he exclaimed, startled by this realization. "If I can understand what you're saying, and you can talk to me in whole sentences, then that must mean you still have your human mind. That'll make it so much easier for me to help you." Inko felt confident enough to puff out her chest and take a step forward. "Bah. Then please, take me to my son. The dragon sighed quietly. I'd love to. Trust me, I really do. But Lord Akatani got him, and he's far more powerful and dangerous than any of the spirits around, including myself at this moment. Don't be afraid, though. I'll find a way to reunite the two of you. He nodded at the building behind him without actually turning around. Until then, why don't you stay at my place for the time being? It's a little run down, I know, but you'll be safe here for the time being. A rumbling sound made both of them turn their heads to the old mansion, only to see another part of the roof cave in next to where the dragon in his much stronger form had crashed into it earlier. The dragon cringed at the sight and Inko huffed at the absurdity of his suggestion. Okay, change of plans, he relented and lowered his head to her level. You can come with me to the bathhouse. But I need you to stick close, and if anyone asks, you're just an ordinary sheep. A fierce determination shone from his eyes. Being so close to the dragon's snout made her uncomfortable all of a sudden. Inko nodded hesitantly. He turned and began to walk away with a seemingly clear destination in mind. I'd fly us back if I could, but as things are, we'll have to take the train. On unsteady legs, Inko followed him slowly. She still was not used to walking like this, in this body. Sheer necessity drove her forward. The dragon stopped and turned back around, waiting for her with a puzzled expression. Are you coming? Yuro. Are you scared of me? He seemed to have mistaken her unsteadiness for fearful hesitation. Inko wasn't given any time to respond before he continued. I'm sorry. I should have noticed sooner. Let me try to change into a less frightening form. As if to free his front paws for a magic trick, he sat back on his haunches. Inko just stopped and watched, unsure of what she was supposed to expect. A soft glow spread from the dragon's chest over his body, though it didn't seem to quite reach all the ends of his limbs. When the glow faded, he hadn't changed at all, except a yellow and orange patterned haori had popped into existence around his shoulders. It wasn't tailored to fit a dragon, but fit anyway, possibly since he was so scrawny. Inko raised her eyebrows at him, though maybe it wasn't visible on a sheep's face. Bah. What was that? He uttered. I'll try to change forms in a few minutes again. My magic is still drained from fighting that snake. Let's just hurry to the train station, shall we? It was when they entered the train wagon that the absurdity of her situation hit Inko once more. She had just boarded a train that was seemingly unoccupied and operated by no one, from a platform in the middle of a rocky wasteland. Next to her sat a disheveled and gaunt dragon, whose head atop the long neck bobbed up and down in time with every light shake of the train wagon. He kept his tail wrapped around him as if to politely leave space for other passengers. Even though the only other passenger in the wagon was her, currently stuck in a sheep body and utterly unable to even climb into one of many available seats with her hooves. Given the kind of bad luck she was having right now, Inko was just happy not to tumble through the wagon whenever the train followed a bend. They sat in silence for a few minutes. Inko had 1,000 questions to ask, but she still didn't trust the bleating noises she produced whenever she opened her mouth, and besides, she feared that no explanation would really help with the plain weirdness of it all. Izuku was her priority. Next came getting her body back. Anything beyond that didn't matter. She looked up when a soft glow engulfed the dragon, just like when he tried to change forms before. Except this time, the Haori stayed and the rest of him changed. A second later, and Inko found an equally gaunt man standing in place of the gaunt dragon. Although he had retained the horns, pointed ears and tufted tail of the dragon, his mostly human appearance was a comforting sight. As was the soft smile on his face when he turned to her. Much better, he said, sitting down on one of the seats behind them. Slightly envious, she huffed at him. Not that he'd noticed. You must have a lot of questions, he said. Let's see, what would you like to know first? Just start somewhere. Right. Of course. He began by telling her about the spirit world. Normally, humans weren't able to see spirits, but in certain places of the world, when the sun set, both worlds merged and the living crossed over. Akatani, the dragon lord who had claimed her son, ruled the town she had stumbled across and the bathhouse next to it with his influence and the fear he instilled in the residents. He had devoured other powerful spirits to obtain their traits and attributes, as well as humans that had gotten lost in the spirit realm, for their life force. To make the latter even easier for him, he had cursed the food that was laid out for the bathhouse guests to turn humans who stole from him into cattle. His tyranny had gone on for centuries, apparently, and Yagi, so the good-natured dragon's name had once fought him successfully when he had still and truly been as powerful as the form Inko had first seen him in. Back then, people had called him the Golden Dragon, All Might. But the peace he had brought to the spirit realm hadn't lasted for long. Lord Akatani, or the snake as Yagi called the more serpentine river dragon, had tricked him. With the powers of a phoenix that he had obtained prior to their fight, he had returned from the dead and hid in the shadows until he had built enough strength to fight Yagi again. And in their second battle, Yagi suffered a devastating defeat that had left him as weakened as he was to this day. Apparently, he'd grown so weak that not even Lord Akatani still recognized his former arch-nemesis. Which was a small boon, given that he'd lost the ability to fly and could summon his old strength only for small periods of time. Still, Yagi had vowed to use whatever strength he had left to save lost humans from the Dragon Lord. How long until you can use your strong form again? A couple of days at least, Yagi responded with a frustrated sigh. Bah. But then Izuku will be. He'll be alright, Yagi claimed, looking out the opposite window at swamps and lakes flying by. Akatani wanted him for himself, so he won't let him fade away. He'll be safe. For a time, anyway. The snake's like that. Sometimes he snatches human children because he believes them to be his son reincarnated, but so far, it never ended well for them. He must be delusional. The sound of the door to the adjacent wagon opening caught Inko's attention. An Oni, a real-life Oni, looking like ones depicted in old folktales, walked past them. Oh, he absolutely is. Yagi nodded. We'll have to get into the bathhouse and work our way up to his living quarters from there to find your son. The Oni stopped next to them, giving Yagi an odd questioning look. You talking to the sheep? You know it doesn't understand you. The skeletal dragon man turned to the Oni, his tail flicking in annoyance. Please mind your own business. Seemingly impressed by the dragon's glare, the Oni walked on by and eventually disappeared into the next wagon. Inko could not help but stare after the fairy tale devil, somewhat unable to believe what she'd just witnessed. It was another one of those moments in which she felt like she couldn't even begin to wrap her head around her entire situation. Maybe, if she went to sleep, she'd wake up in her bed at home and the entirety of this day had just been a nightmare. Now, that would make a ton more sense. If only it didn't feel so real. Now, where was I? Yagi asked. The bathhouse. Yes. Akatani lives on top. That's where he'll keep Izuku. Coincidentally, I know that he also keeps train tickets in his bureau that'll make this train take you to the place Akatani banned his brother to. My mentor once told me that Yoichi is good-natured and willing to help any human who has lost their human form so they may return to the realm of the living. That sounded good. Hopeful, too. There was just one thought that bothered Inko. Why are you going to such lengths for us? For a number of reasons, he said vaguely. Too many to list, really. Inko nudged his leg with a finger. Well, name me one. Well, He didn't spare her a glance, just balled both hands on his knees into fists. I was once human, too. You were cursed, too. To turn into a dragon like that evil lord. No, not like him. He's a true-born river dragon spirit. As he continued to struggle with the right phrasing, Inko nudged him again impatiently. I stayed too long in the spirit realm. She stared at him wide-eyed. Did that mean the same was going to happen to Izuku? Her boy would turn into a spirit. Yagi held up his hands as if the gesture would do anything to placate her. Look, I know you're worried about your boy. Wow, first time he guessed right, she thought to herself. But this process takes time, Yagi continued. I didn't want to put it so bluntly, but humans can't really exist in the spirit realm. Either they fade from existence when night falls, or they take a meal a spirit is offered to them, which will cause their bodies to slowly adapt to the spirit world, turning them into spirits themselves. Your curse spared you from either fate. This time, Inko put both of her hands hooves up on the seat next to Yagi to read the answer to her question directly from his face. Then what about Izuku? He furrowed his brows. As I said, Akatani won't let him fade, so that means Izuku will turn. The process takes a couple of weeks, however. That's plenty of time for us to get him out. Cold dread sunk into the pit of Inko's stomach as she settled back on the ground. Her son, her poor boy, not only was he in the hands of that monster, he was going to lose his human shape, too. She didn't want him subjected to the horror and discomfort she was experiencing, and the thought of Izuku permanently becoming a spirit, like Yagi, terrified her. After all, if Yagi was still here and a dragon, that meant he couldn't go back to the human world, didn't it? Then silence stretched between her and the dragon. Look on the bright side, Yagi piped up again and turned to her with a smile. No one is going to suspect a sheep to steal a child out from under the snake's watch. Izuku thought he was going to die when the dragon suddenly let go of him and he plummeted towards the balcony of the bathhouse. Although the drop wasn't as deep as feared, Izuku still tumbled through the open balcony door and landed roughly on the wooden floorboards in the living quarters atop the bathhouse. His shoulder throbbed with a dull ache when he pushed himself back up into a sitting position to turn around. The serpentine river dragon with the white and red scales and carp whiskers coiled once more in the air before he came shooting at the open balcony door. Instinctively, Izuku ducked and threw his arms over his head, firmly convinced that the huge dragon was going to crash into the building and tear the roof away. A gust of wind rushed over Izuku, but the sounds of splintering wood and breaking shingles never came. When he opened his eyes again, there was a man standing on the balcony. The last rays of the setting sun on the horizon highlighted his silhouette, including the horns on his head and the long tufted tail behind him. Izuku raised a hand to shield himself from the sun, only to notice with a start that the light passed through his fingers. He was fading. Ice-cold panic gripped his heart. Adrenaline flooded his veins. Before he knew it, he had scrambled back to his feet and was running for the sliding door further into the building. His fingers passed through the door frame when he tried to open it. "Oh, what are you doing, my little stream? There's no need to be afraid. All we need is there." Izuku turned around to face the dragon man, pressing his back against the door in desperation and fear. The stranger picked up an orange-like fruit from a decorative bowl on a sideboard. By using his claw-tipped fingers, he peeled and sliced it with frightening ease. "I would never let you fade. Not after we've only just been reunited, Mikumo." "What are you talking about?" Izuku shouted at him. Tears pricked at his eyes. The dragon man knelt down in front of him and held a piece of fruit up to Izuku's face. "Why, you're my son, of course. The resemblance is uncanny. You even got his adorable freckles. This time, there's no mistake. I'm not your son. I'm Izuku Midoriya and I want my mom. The sooner you forget about your human name, the better. Your old memories will return to you over time and then you'll recognize me for who I am." The man smirked at him in a way that did not bode well. "For now, eat this. It'll stop you from fading." Izuku was reluctant to accept his offering, having seen what the food his mother had eaten had done to her, but in this instant, he was losing the feeling in his limbs rapidly and the fear for his life won out over any caution. Unable to use his hands, he bit into the piece of fruit the man held out to him and swallowed the sweet juice. Immediately, his limbs regained form and color. His hands and feet felt like pins and needles. "Aw, I can't wait for your fangs to grow back in," the dragon man cooed. When he reached out to ruffle Izuku's hair, Izuku quickly slid down the door so that his clawed fingers only met thin air. "I'm not a dragon." Izuku scrambled away from him, eyes scanning the room for another door, but the only one seemed to be the one he had just escaped from. The one the dragon man knelt in front of. In his growing despair to get away, Izuku ran to the balcony. A single look was enough to tell him that they were very high up. There was water below, but no way to tell how deep it was. Chances also were that the golden dragon wasn't going to appear again to catch him and carry him to safety, like when he'd tried to jump into the moat surrounding the town. "Why do you run from me, Mikumo? I'll take good care of you. You may have everything you want." Izuku turned back to him. Those blood-red eyes didn't seem trustworthy at all. "I want my mom. And I want to go home." The dragon lord rose from the floor and walked a few steps up to him. "That woman is not like you. Though I'd wished she were my former wife and your true mother, her soul is not strong enough to be a dragon spirit." "Mom's the strongest person I know," Izuku argued. "Of course. To a carp, a lake might very well be the sea, for it is only known its pond." The lord smiled at him, fangs glinting in the last rays of sunlight. If she'd have the spiritual strength of a dragon, she might have resisted the curse. "But you are a strong spirit, right? You can bring her here and turn her back." "I'm sorry, my little stream," he said in a way that didn't sound like he was sorry at all. "It's a curse to punish thieves, and that woman has, indeed, stolen from the bathhouse." The dragon man had come close enough for Izuku to recognize a chance to run past him and head for the door again. He only needed to time it right. What about the golden dragon? He'd be willing to help. "All might." Izuku's captor laughed snidely. "He's a delinquent who loves to upset the natural order of this realm. I imagine, in this very moment, he's counting his blessings that I didn't kill him." "Hey, boss." A distorted voice sounded from the end of a bronze pipe on a wall. "We got a visitor here for you. You'll never guess who it is." For a moment, the voice drew the dragon lord's attention and Izuku seized his chance to make a beeline for the door. He dashed past the man, tore the sliding door open, and kept running while frantically searching for another door, hallway or, preferably, a staircase that led down and out of the building. As if by magic, a sliding door slammed shut in front of him. Izuku tried to pull it back open, but it wouldn't budge, and before he knew it, someone grabbed him by the back of his shirt and lifted him off his feet. The dragon had to be impossibly strong to hold him up with just one hand. Even so, Izuku struggled and kicked his legs. Without success. The dragon lord carried him away effortlessly, into a hallway nearby. Now. I've said you can have everything you want, but if you are insisting to misbehave, I believe a timeout is in order. We shall talk some more after you've calmed down." A gust of wind blew open a door to a windowless room. The floor within was littered with toys and murals of flying dragons adorned the walls. A round bed stuffed with cushions stood by the back wall. "No. Let go of me. I don't belong here." The town with the bathhouse had turned into a whole other world by the time Inko passed through it again. Night had fallen and paper lanterns had been lit along the streets. Whereas it had been completely devoid of life at daytime, there was now a right hustle and bustle among the stalls. Only the minority of townspeople looked like humans, and even then Inko wasn't sure she hadn't missed pointed ears or fangs poking out of the corners of their mouths. Spirits, is what they were, according to Yagi. And Inko, at this moment, was cattle. She couldn't deny the fright she felt when all those strange and scary-looking people turned to look down at her in passing. Sometimes, spirits reached for her with clawed hands, saying something about Lord Akatani's possession. Thankfully, Yagi kept them at bay, either with a glare, a low growl or a brief explanation that he was taking care of the sheep. After the third encounter or so, she stuck extra close to the scrawny dragon man's side all the way to the bathhouse beyond the bridge. The bathhouse wasn't just that. Its architecture was a mix of stone and wood, an amalgamation of a castle, a palace and a pagoda, and yet no description seemed to do the multi-storied building justice. Scented steam wafted out of open doors and windows. With impossible boldness, or maybe blatant carelessness, Yagi walked in with her in tow, and they were engulfed by a rush of moist and warm air. Needless to say, the disheveled dragon man with the sheep drew many odd looks and, so Inko guessed, quickly became the cause for complaints. It wasn't long before they were stopped by a handful of bathhouse workers. "So you've brought back the Lord's sheep," a man with a dangerous glint in his eye said to Yagi. Blue flames danced about the horns on his head. His hands were clawed and his skin looked like a patchwork of scar tissue. "Leave it with us, we'll take good care of it." "I wish to bargain with Lord Akatani in person," Yagi demanded. "Bargain, he says." The fire demon laughed at him. "What's there to bargain? You're right, old man Yagi, you know that. All right, I'll let you through. This is gonna be interesting." He led the two of them to an elevator deep inside of the bathhouse. Its doors were polished to shine like gold, elaborately ornamented, and before Inko knew it, both Yagi and her had been rudely shoved inside. Last thing she saw was the scarred, smirking face of the demon before the doors closed behind them. "Let me do the talking," Yagi said as they stood and waited for the elevator to reach its destination. Inko bit back on a reply. "No kidding. It's not like anyone else understood her even if she tried to speak." Yagi turned to her with a grin plastered on his face as if to cheer her up. She did not feel cheerful. But the ding, the elevator stopped and its doors opened into a long, empty hallway. To either side, there were multiple closed doors. "Akatani's living quarters," Yagi said as he walked out into the hallway. Though he didn't mention it, both of them knew that this had to be where the Dragon Lord had brought Izuku to. Yagi tried to open one of the doors. It was locked. Before either of them could reach the middle of the hallway, one of the previously locked doors behind them burst open, and two stools came flying out that practically forced themselves on them. The pieces of furniture pushed them all the way down the hallway and through a set of double doors into the adjacent office. Had Inko been human or at least as human as Yagi, she might have ended up sitting on the stool when it finally stopped moving, but as it were, she just hung on top of it facing the way they had come. Feeling like she'd hit a new low in her life, she flailed her legs until she managed to hop off and finally turned around. Charms, amulets and occult symbols the likes of which she had never seen before covered the walls of the office. Papers, books and writing utensils were neatly arranged on a huge oak desk. Behind the desk sat a tall man who was grinning broadly at them with fanged teeth. Sharp-pointed, dark blue horns poked out of his short white hair. His ears were pointed just like Yagi's, but covered in small scales the same blood red as his eyes. More scales covered his clawed hands. He wore expensive-looking, traditional clothing in red and white, and long feathers shimmering in all colors of the fire stuck out from behind his shoulders. Inko also thought she heard the swish of a long tail, but it wasn't Yagi's. The stranger spelled danger all over. Lord Akatani. Inko instinctively took a step back when he leaned forward on his desk. "Today must be my lucky day," the Dragon Lord said. "To think that out of all the people who'd bring back my lost sheep, it'd be you, Yagi." He folded his red-scaled clawed hands in front of him, and Inko reminded herself that they weren't actually dipped in blood. "Are you finally ready to admit that even All Might can no longer protect those precious humans of yours?" Yagi withstood the man's piercing gaze. "I am not here to return your sheep to you," he said. "Oh? But it's right here, mine for the taking, is it not?" When his eyes met hers, Inko suddenly understood what Yagi had meant when he'd asked her to pretend that she was just a regular sheep. Lord Akatani's eyes seemed to stare right into her soul. She quickly avoided the eye contact and began to move about the office, pretending to explore an unfamiliar environment. That's what a simple-minded sheep would do, right? An open door to the side piqued her interest. "I wish to work off her debt," Yagi said, recapturing the Dragon's Lord attention. "She ate from the food that was laid out for your customers, right?" That means she owes you money. And if it's the only way to save her from your insatiable appetite for humans, I'll work at the bathhouse in her stead." "How interesting," Akatani said. "This human has racked up quite the debt, you know. Practically emptied the whole stall." Inko couldn't help but huff quietly in anger. She may be a stress eater, but not a glutton. What a jerk. "I don't care," Yagi said in earnest. "I'll work for her as long as it takes to get her out of here." In the meantime, Inko had slowly made her way over to the door. Beyond lay another hallway and an opposing door with a plaque that read Mikumo. Her sheep ears swiveled forward as she picked up faint noises. The sounds of small hands banging and clawing on a wall. There was a child locked in that room. Izuku. It had to be him. She made to run out into the hallway but found herself hesitant to move, like she'd been tied to the office with a rubber band. The Dragon Lord's presence at her back made her blood run cold. Sheep or no sheep, there was no way he'd let her go snooping around his private chambers. "So you will enter servitude by your own volition. This must truly be the best day of my life." Akatani laughed, still talking to Yagi, even though she had briefly felt his gaze on her. "You know, because I'm in such a good mood, I'll sweeten the deal. If you work for me for an entire 3 weeks, not only will I consider this human's debt to be paid back in full, I'll also restore her original form." Startled by his words, Inko turned back to the office. It's a trap. It couldn't possibly be anything else. She could hear Akatani swishing his tail again. His gaze was that of a predator on the hunt and boring into Yagi. Akatani lowered his voice. "You've run yourself ragged to save humans. Now I want to see you grind your bones to dust." At that moment it became painfully obvious to Inko that Yagi had been mistaken. Akatani knew about Yagi's former identity, he was just pretending not to know. There was no other way to explain the amount of hatred the Dragon Lord was emanating. "You'll find my bones don't break easily," Yagi said, tail flicking like he was but a second away from pouncing at Akatani. "We'll see about that." Inko's breath caught in her throat. Her only ally in this mad world was about to sell his health and dignity for her. Cautiously, she walked up to Yagi, whose eyes were locked on his arch-nemesis. Lacking another means to gain his attention, she pushed her nose under his hand. In response, he ruffled the wool on top of her head gently. The soft smile he gave her was probably meant to tell her that he knew what he was getting himself into. Inko still doubted it. "Despite of her loss of self, the human seems to have taken a liking to you," Akatani remarked. "I want her to stay with me so I can guarantee her safety myself," Yagi demanded. "You should know by now that you can't guarantee for anything, but who am I to take away your delusions?" "Fine. I'll allow it as long as the sheep doesn't leave the bathhouse." The Dragon Lord pulled open a drawer, took out a piece of paper and a quill, and placed both in front of Yagi. Kanji and katakana appeared on the paper as though they were written by an invisible hand. "Now then, let's make it a proper contract. Please sign with your name. Your true name." "Ah." Inko Midoriya, something about Lord Akatani's order had compelled Inko to speak up even though she hadn't intended to. For once she was glad her form only allowed a soft bleat to escape her mouth. Akatani raised an eyebrow at her behavior. "Yagi the Gaunt Dragon Man said. It's the only name I have. I thought you were a human-born spirit. I lost my human name many years ago." The Dragon Lord sighed in disappointment. "Then Yagi will have to do." In silent agreement, Yagi signed the contract and Akatani took the paper from him. He made a dismissive gesture. "Very well. Hop to it, then. I haven't got all day to talk to you." They never got a chance to explore the upper levels of the bathhouse further. A sudden gust of wind from seemingly nowhere blew them out of the office. For a moment or two, Yagi managed to fight the winds before he, too, was swept off his feet and tumbled alongside Inko through the hallway back into the open elevator. "It's been a pleasure doing business with you," Akatani called after them. When the doors closed and the elevator began to descend, Inko rose back to her feet, dizzy and swaying, and once more comparing herself to a ball of yarn falling out of her knitting basket back home. At the entrance level of the bathhouse, the fire demon had seemingly waited for their return. Somehow, he'd already heard of the deal Yagi had struck with Akatani. "So, the sheep's gonna stay," the demon said, exhaled a puff of smoke, and waved for them to follow him. "Well, here's a piece of advice. Keep it away from the customers. If I hear as much as a single complaint about cattle in the bathhouse, there'll be roasted mutton for dinner." A bright blue flame ignited in the palm of his raised hand. "I won't let you hurt her." Yagi glared at him, but the fire demon just smirked. "Yeah? And what are you going to do about that? Bite me with those blunt teeth of yours?" They walked through the narrow corridors in the back of the bathhouse, past staff members and staff rooms. The floors were all laid out with tatami. Cherry blossoms and other floral patterns were depicted on the paper of the sliding doors, though the further they went, the less effort had been put into the interior design. "Here's your assigned room." The fire demon pulled one of the sliding doors open, beyond which lay a very small room, possibly the space that was left over when the floor had been divided into staff and utility rooms. It contained a few brooms, brushes and buckets. "It's a broom closet," Yagi stated, unimpressed. "It's got a nice view," the demon argued, pointing at the sliding door that made up the opposing wall. Yagi pulled it open to reveal a small balcony looking out over a large body of water. Wooden walls separated it from the balconies of the other, proper rooms to either side. It's ridiculous, but Inko hadn't expected first-class conditions, anyway. Or second-class conditions. Or anything better than a stable, really. Though this was technically a step up compared to a stable. Not that it would help with her overall situation in the slightest. The space was sufficient for her, especially since she was even smaller in this sheep body, but Dobby had assigned Yagi to that room, and he was rather tall, even in human form. "Don't get comfy just yet," the demon said. "Your first job's already waiting for you." Begrudgingly, they followed him once more through the long corridors of the bathhouse to a bathroom with a single huge stone tub that, to Inko, resembled a giant ramen bowl. It was covered in algae, mud and other, faintly foul-smelling substances. Judging by how dry and cracked the layer of gunk looked, the tub hadn't been taken care of in a long while. The fire demon presented the room to Yagi, twirling with his arms spread wide, like an overly enthusiastic real estate agent. "Aren't you in luck, my friend? You get to clean out the big tub." Yagi was not as enthusiastic. The woman with long, dark purple hair wearing worker's garb and carrying a bucket passed by the bathroom, and Dobby grabbed her by the arm and pulled her through the doorway. She tore herself out of his grasp and slapped his hand away. Apart from a few red markings on her face and the glint of a fang in her mouth, she looked surprisingly human. "Keep your grubby hands off me, Dobby. I got a task for you from high up," the demon said to her. "Show Yagi the ropes, but no helping. He's got to clean the big tub by himself before tomorrow." "Are you kidding me? I've got enough to do as it is," she complained, though to no avail. "Hey." Dobby simply walked out on them, leaving Inko and Yagi alone with the woman. Yagi waved at her in greeting, more sheepishly than the actual sheep in the room. Once she got a proper look at him, she gasped. "You're that dragon who kept opposing all rivers in one for years, aren't you?" she said, astounded. She pushed Yagi and, by extension, Inko, deeper into the bathroom and closed the door behind them. "What are you doing here? The Lord hates your guts. He's gonna work you to death." "I'm sturdier than I look," Yagi replied. Inko stuck her head out from behind Yagi, but found herself held back by Yagi's tail in front of her chest. "What's the sheep doing in the bathhouse?" the woman asked. "She's a human I'm trying to protect." She put a hand to her face. "Damn. You two must be in a world of trouble. I haven't got much time to help you, but I'll do what I can." She gestured at the stone tub. "First of all, that tub isn't the only of its kind and we don't really need it till tomorrow. But if Dobby comes round to check, I guess you better get it done. Among the Lord's henchmen, he's one of the worst. You'll need to know how to operate the mechanisms in the bathhouse and some equipment to get started. Oh, my name's Midnight, by the way." The first friendly soul Inko had met at the bathhouse. She thanked her lucky stars. "Thank you very much, Ms. Midnight," Yagi said. "I'm Yagi and this is." He moved his tail out of Inko's way to finally let her step forward. "Ah. Inko. Yay, a sheep, I got that much the first time around," Midnight said, giving him the same odd look the Oni aboard the train had. "Inko. Her name's Inko," he clarified and pinched the bridge of his nose. "Never mind for now." True to her word, Midnight showed them how to operate the pulley mechanisms behind the wall panels. They were primarily used to order water up from the boiler room in the basement of the bathhouse. Different tokens could be sent down to receive differently scented infusions, though with the cleaning tokens, they would only get the uninspired water-scented kind. Midnight left them, or rather Yagi, with a mop, cleaning rags and a bucket filled with fresh water, and hurried back to her own work. Inko imagined that she had already risked getting into trouble with her superiors, given how much time she had spent to help Yagi get started. And therein lay a problem. When Yagi picked up the broom and bucket, Inko found herself standing there, wondering if that was supposed to be it. Just Yagi, working himself to the bone at a low chance that the Dragon Lord would hold up his end of the deal and turn her back. How on earth were they supposed to rescue Izuku like this? The fear for her son clenched her heart. "Bah. Yagi, wait up." He walked past her, sighing. "Well then, let's get started." "Ah. Yagi." When he still didn't listen, Inko reached out to grab his wrist, only to be reminded once more of her lack of flexible digits. Yagi's tail, however, conveniently brushed past her head. She bit into the matted tuft at the end. That got his attention fast. Indignant, Yagi spun around and yanked himself free. If he'd lost a few hairs because of it, Inko didn't consider it her fault. "Ah. Bah. Is this your entire plan? To work for Akatani? What about Izuku?" We'll bide our time until the snake leaves for a business trip or until he lets Izuku out of his chambers. Then we'll act. They can't stay up there forever. And while we work for Akatani, we're free to move about the bathhouse. Working off your debt is just a backup plan. I'm honestly not quite sure he'll actually turn you back, but if all else fails, it's still a better plan than none." There was such seriousness and determination in his voice that Inko didn't know how to respond. Yagi's unrelenting willingness to help her family humbled her and she felt terrible and useless, being stuck as a sheep. Since she didn't say anything, he set to work and it wasn't until she saw Yagi trying to remove the dried algae with a barely wet mop that she desperately wanted to smack her own forehead and realized, apparently, there was still a lot she could do. Inko might have been turned into a sheep, but she still knew a thing or two about cleaning. She jumped up against one of the wall panels that Midnight had shown them and tried to grab the rope within with her teeth. Boy, did she miss having hands. After the third unsuccessful attempt, Yagi noticed and walked over to her. "What are you doing?" He looked at the rope. "That one was for filling the tub with water, wasn't it?" "Ah. Bah. Let the grime soak first. It'll be easier to clean that way." "You're sure?" She nodded with as much confidence as she could. "Baha. I'm a single mom. I've got some experience with household duties." "Alright, then." Chuckling, he operated the pulley mechanism for her and the bottom of the rub began to fill with hot water that poured down from above. After a few more simple instructions, Inko let him get back to removing the layer of algae but didn't stay far behind. She picked up a cleaning rag with her mouth and set to work herself. Due to her limited capabilities, the best she could do was to drop the rag where needed and rub it against the dirty surface with a hoof. This method only allowed her to clean small spots at a time, but it was far better than standing on the sidelines and doing nothing. If she could only take enough workload off Yagi to keep Dabi and Akatani from overworking him, while the two of them waited for an opportunity to save Izuku, it was worth any effort and struggle on her part. They worked together throughout the night to remove the gunk and grime layer by layer. True-born nature spirits, so Yagi told her, visited the bathhouse to be purified and rid of the pollution they had accumulated in the human realm. Apparently, purification rituals helped a great deal to restore a spirit's energy. Sunrise was maybe just an hour away by the time not just the tub but the entire room was finally spotless. Inko and Yagi opted to head to their assigned room to get some much-needed rest and sleep, however little that fire demon would allow them before he came around with the next task. As Inko stumbled along the corridor on exhausted legs, she feared she'd never lose the disgusting taste of dirty water and algae-covered rags. 2 steps into the storage room, she all but collapsed on the tatami floor from exhaustion. Yagi sat down with his back to the wall and let out a tired sigh. In her sleep, Inko dreamed of being human. In her dream, she didn't remember ever getting turned into a sheep in the first place. She didn't remember that nightmare of a day she had. All she knew was that she was standing atop a hill, in front of a towering tree with long, gnarled branches. Soft sunlight filtered through its canopy. A rope with paper streamers was wrapped around its massive trunk, marking it as holy. Inexplicably, Inko felt comforted by its side and safe in its shade. Looking around, she quickly discovered shadows that seemed to be cast by 2 people standing or sitting on the other side of the tree. One shadow stuck out on either side. It looked like she wouldn't be able to reach both at the same time and would have to choose whether she went right or left around the tree's trunk. Both shadows looked identical. Even though she hesitated, curiosity eventually drove her to explore. She took the right path. The longer she walked, the farther away from the tree she seemed to be getting. The sunlight dimmed. Clouds gathered in the sky. The shadow she was walking towards grew shorter and shorter until she could see the feet of the boy it was connected to. There, dressed in traditional clothing, stood her son. "Izuku." Shouting, Inko ran towards him and Izuku turned around to her with a clueless and lost expression. Her feet grew leaden. Her movement slowed until Inko had to fight hard to cross the distance. An invisible force seemed to hold Izuku in place as well. "Mom." He reached out his hand and she reached out hers. The roar of a wild flood sounded behind her and all of a sudden, huge amounts of water rushed past them. A river's ice-cold stream had split to flow around her and converged beyond Izuku again, trapping them in a small, dry space in the middle. The currents looked strong and deadly. "Izuku." She screamed her heart out while still trying to reach him and pull him into her embrace. There were tears in her son's eyes. Like a fear come true, the river's streams closed right in front of her. In a heartbeat, Izuku was surrounded by water and swept away by the currents. The coldness of the river filled Inko's soul with dread. She struggled and fought and screamed. The water blocked out what little light of the sun had still reached her through the overcast sky, and the world was engulfed by darkness. When the light returned, Inko found herself back in front of the tree. The shadow to the right was gone. Izuku was gone. And yet, the tree's sight calmed her soul and restored her hope once more. She felt like she was experiencing a déjà vu, like Izuku had been taken from her before and that she needed to find a way to get him back. In this moment and in this peculiar scenery, there was little else she could do but to take the left path around the tree and see what the other shadow connected to. This time, she stayed close to the tree's trunk. Never strayed she away farther than an arm's length, but the trunk was impossibly wide. Above of her, the tree's canopy grew lighter, allowing her to walk in bright sunlight. The pleasant chirping of cicadas filled her ears. It must be summer, she concluded. Next to the trunk, in the remaining shade of the tree, sat a blonde teen wearing a middle school uniform. When she approached him, he turned around to her, but his face remained obscured by shadows. Inko felt as though she should know him from a time long past. His name was on the tip of her tongue and yet out of reach. She wanted to test a syllable or two, but when she opened her mouth, the only sound she produced was a soft bleat. At the start, Inko realized she'd turned into a sheep. As if sensing her fright and confusion, the teen got up from the ground and walked over to her. He gently took her face into his hands, and even though she still couldn't make out his face, she thought he had to be smiling softly. Inko let her head grow heavy in his palms and closed her eyes. Within seconds, a pleasant warmth had lulled her back into sleep. Izuku awoke, sadly, not in his own bed at home, but on the floor tiles of the child's room the Dragon Lord had locked him into. Rubbing the sleep from his eyes, Izuku remembered how the man had lifted him up by his shirt and put into this windowless room when Izuku had tried to run away. Truth be told, if he were on a vacation with his mom, and this room would have been part of a house they rented stuffed with toys, a huge, soft bed, and beautiful paintings on the walls, he would have loved it. But no. His mom had been turned into a sheep, Izuku had almost faded from existence the evening before, this crazy dragon was mistaking him for his son, and all that meant a beautifully decorated children's room looked more like a gilded cage to him. Which was exactly why Izuku had banged on the walls, shouted and rattled the door handle, until exhaustion had overtaken him. He had heard faint voices through the door the previous night. Hopefully, someone other than the Lord had heard him. Izuku rubbed an itchy spot on his head. There was a small bump there. He must have hit his head when he'd fallen asleep. Suddenly, the door handle moved. Izuku scrambled back to his feet quickly and put some distance between himself and the door. Unsurprisingly, the Dragon Lord walked into the room and closed the door behind himself. "Good morning, my little stream," he greeted Izuku, awfully cheerful. "Breakfast is about to be ready and I've brought a change of clothes for you." Indeed, there was a bundle of green clothes slung over his arm. "I don't want to eat with you," Izuku just said, although he was feeling hungry. His stomach had the audacity to betray him with a low grumble. "But you should," the Dragon Lord said and stepped closer to where Izuku was pressing himself against the edge of the bed. "You don't want to start fading again by sunset, do you?" A ominous sly smile spread on the white-haired man's face. "Even then, I don't have to eat with you," Izuku emphasized, remaining defiant. "And I don't want your clothes, either." The Dragon Lord tutted at him. Now. I can't let you run around in those human rags, Mikumo. If you keep being so unruly, you leave me no other choice but to dress you myself. I told you before, my name is." The Dragon Man lifted his hand and grasped at the air as if he'd caught the word before Izuku could utter it. My name is his name. He remembered his name fine, but when he tried to say it, it was like his throat closed up. "Since you've been so free to tell me your name yesterday already, I went ahead and cast a little spell for you to help you with the forgetting." "No. I don't want to. Just let me go." Despair dug its claws into Izuku's heart once more and he made a mad dash for the door at a very slim chance to make it out before the dragon could turn around. He had made the calculation without considering the Dragon Lord's tail. Just as Izuku tried to run past, the white and red scaled appendage came up to his midsection, catching him and curling around him. Thankfully, it didn't wrap up his hands, which left Izuku with plenty of room to struggle. The dragon didn't even flinch at Izuku's punches and kicks. "I don't remember you being such a handful in your first life," his kidnapper said with a sigh of annoyance. "I suppose we're doing this the hard way, then." He pulled up the sleeves of his haori and grabbed Izuku's shirt again. Now, Izuku was usually a very well-behaved boy. But, given the situation he was in, he found it well within his right to resist that man's attempt to dress him with every fiber of his being. Izuku flailed his arms, kicked his legs, and generally did his very best to make sure the new clothes didn't end up where they were meant to go, even if the dragon's claws had shredded his shirt from back home in seconds. At one point, Izuku had found himself suspended in the air held up by one hand of the Dragon Lord, one foot trapped in the coil of the dragon's tail, still kicking at the man with the other, while the Dragon Lord tried to wrestle Izuku's free arm into the sleeve of a kimono. "Stop resisting." The frustration in the dragon's voice was apparent, which told Izuku he was doing quite well. It cost him a lot of strength, however. Before long, the inevitable happened. Pain blossomed along Izuku's upper left arm when the Dragon Lord's claws cut not just through cloth but into his skin. He screamed and was immediately dropped to the floor. Izuku slapped a hand on the wound. It wasn't deep but bleeding. The dragon's red eyes seemed to be glowing, his pupils had contracted and turned into slits. He was practically fuming with barely contained anger. This is what happens when you don't obey. I do not want to hurt you, but if you keep resisting, you leave me no other choice. Izuku stared up at the tall man, suddenly feeling powerless and small. The scare of the sudden injury had drained all fight from him. I shall fetch a bandage to wrap up that wound, the Lord said with a firm voice and threw the remaining clothes to the floor in front of Izuku. By the time I return, you will be dressed. He then turned and left, once again pulling the door shut behind him. The lock clicked into place and Izuku burst into tears. It was hopeless. That man would rather hurt him than let him go. A little while later, Izuku sat at a lavishly laid table in a large dining room with plenty of locked doors, wearing an expensive kimono and feeling like a toy in the presence of the Dragon Lord. After what had happened earlier, he did not dare to meet the dragon's eyes and barely found it within him to respond when asked. In his mind, he was still screaming in protest. And the bump on his head kept itching. Meanwhile, Inko was very reluctant to wake up and move from her sleeping space. There was something like a rolled-up blanket slung all around her. Though not as soft as an actual blanket, it was covered in a fine layer of plush and radiated a comfortable warmth. She nuzzled her chin into the plush, ruffling the hairs, enjoying the earthen smell. It wasn't until she opened her eyes that she discovered, for one, that she was still stuck as a sheep and, far more importantly, that Yagi had shifted into his dragon form in his sleep and somehow managed to fit his long body into the very limited space of the storage room by wrapping himself several times around her. Her head had come to rest on his neck and, now that she knew the blanket wasn't a blanket, she felt a little embarrassed by how much she had enjoyed the sunshine warmth his spirit form emitted. Inko had always hoped that one day she'd wake up in the warm embrace of a man again, like the protagonists from the cheesy romance novels she read at times. But never would she have imagined it'd happen like this. It probably didn't even count, seeing how neither of them was human at this moment. Funnily enough, her being awake and Yagi being still asleep put her into a new predicament. There was no way to escape this dragon's hug without waking him. She wiggled her legs, testing the available amount of space, which sadly, wasn't much. Also sadly, Yagi stirred. He yawned and lifted his head, blinking the sleep from his eyes. When he turned to look at her, he became abruptly aware of where Inko had ended up during the night. Yagi startled so badly that, in a single instant, he jumped to his feet, knocked the shelves off one wall with his head and whipped his tail against the other, toppling a collection of brooms. The entire room was in disarray from one second to the next, and it was raining cleaning rags and brushes down on Inko from the dislocated wall shelves. She tried to cover her head with her hooves until the last item had fallen. I'm so sorry. Yagi dug his claws into the flooring and stood perfectly still, as if the room wasn't a complete mess already, and his dragon body still pressed against the walls at sharp angles. I didn't meant to. Inko could have sworn his cheeks glowed pink through that fine layer of white fur. There was no holding back on the laugh that burst from Inko. It didn't sound much like a laugh, or maybe like a sheep's version of it, but that didn't matter to her when her dragon roommate was pulling such stunts. After a moment of stunned silence, Yagi relaxed a little. Are you alright? Ah. It's fine. I slept very soundly. He grinned and chuckled awkwardly. Glad to hear it. Ah. Can you shift back? Give me a moment. By stalking carefully across the floor littered with cleaning supplies, Yagi made his way over to the door. A soft glow spread across his body while he removed himself out of the awkward position, and by the time he got the door open, he stumbled out into the hallway in human form. There you are. The voice coming from the hallway belonged to Midnight. Inko got up and walked over to see what was going on. Quick, Midnight said to them. I'll take you to the lunchroom so you can grab a bite before Dobby'll drag you off to more work. I doubt he'll give you any time to eat something. That's very kind of you. Thank you, Yagi said. Whether that invitation included her or not, Inko still followed them through the bathhouse. The lunchroom was large and stuffed with benches at which staff members were sitting, many of which to her surprise were spirit children. It looked like the kitchen was handing out bowls of plain rice. Most other meals were likely reserved for Lord Akatani and his guests. Mr. Yagi. Some of the children seemed to recognize the dragon man by her side and quickly gathered around Yagi and Inko. Among them was a girl with long black hair whose features reminded Inko of a frog. The tip of a very long tongue stuck out from her mouth. She regarded Inko intently. What are you doing here? A boy with the head of a crow asked. I'm working for Akatani. The pink-skinned girl gasped at his reply. But why would you do that? The work off a human's dead. Is that her, Mr. Yagi? The frog girl approached Inko. Aw, she looks so tame for a sheep. Is it okay if I pet her, Ribbit? You'd have to ask her, technically. Sensing nothing but innocent curiosity from the girl, Inko took a step forward and let her stroke her head with a large hand. The girl smiled blissfully at her. She's so fluffy. Ah. You've got some rice on your face, dear. Inko's bleating made the girl pause. Huh? Is something wrong? Yagi looked from Inko to the frog girl. No, Tsu. You just have some rice stuck on your cheek, he explained. I'm sorry. By using her long tongue, Tsu tried to reach the grain, but missed the spot. He bent down to her eye level. May I? The frog girl turned to him and he removed the rice grain gently with his thumb. Ah. That's better. Thank you, Mr. Yagi and Ms. Sheep. Her name is Inko, Yagi corrected her. Thank you, Ms. Inko, Ribbit. It felt nice to be treated like a human being by someone else other than Yagi. Inko was quickly growing to like the girl. Hey? What's the fucking sheep doing in the lunchroom? There's pens for cattle, you dumbasses. The shout that drew everyone's attention came from a boy about the same age as Izuku, who'd only just walked into the room. He had light blonde, spiky hair and a glossy black salamander's tail with orange spots. More orange and black splotches were scattered across his skin. Ah. Watch your language, young man. Once more, Yagi had turned to her first before he replied to the child. She's a human, Kitsuki. Please mind your language around her. The boy, who had seemingly observed how Yagi had listened to her, gave the dragon man an incredulous look. Wait, what? Don't tell me you can understand the sheep. That's fucking ridiculous. Everyone knows they lose their mind when they turn. For one swear word too many, but also to prove him wrong, Inko jumped forward and rammed her head into the boy's stomach, toppling him easily with her surprise headbutt. Well, she hasn't, Tsu said, giggling. From his spot on the floor, Kitsuki stared up at the sheep in front of him, utterly perplexed. Inko quickly came to like all of the bathhouse children. They were very keen to help Yagi and her, and even went against Yagi's protest and stole vegetables and fruit for her from the kitchen. They were surprisingly apt at it, too. Now that the proverbial cat was out of the bag and most of the children, plus Midnight, had discovered that Inko could talk and that Yagi understood her for unknown reasons, they asked her all sorts of questions about the human world over lunch. Which weren't really easy to answer, because how do you describe an entire world when you've only seen a fraction of it, or, more precisely, just a single prefecture of Japan? Still, she was happy to answer to the best of her capabilities. It was only later that day, when Dabi had Yagi, and, by extension Inko, too, scrub more bathtubs, that Yagi told her how the children had ended up at the bathhouse. They were all orphans. Most of the teens had been taken in back when Akatani still ruled the lands, and a powerful witch had run the bathhouse. According to Yagi, the witch hadn't exactly been the friendly kind, either, and yes, he'd phrased it in just that peculiar way, but had been more interested in money and reputation than gaining power and taking control, which had made her a little easier to deal with. She had also vowed not to refuse anyone who came to her looking for work, and that was why many lost children had sought shelter at the bathhouse. After Akatani had come back from the dead, fought and eventually beat Yagi, he had forced the witch to leave town and took over the bathhouse, including all existing staff and the children among them. Although Akatani was not known to take pity on children or to keep his word as a businessman, there had been new additions to the staff. When he killed a true-born spirit for their powers or abilities, Akatani sometimes took their children in and nurtured their hatred to twist them into his most faithful servants. Abi, while already out of his teen years, was one such example and had, according to bathhouse rumors, even wanted his father dead. Not every true-born spirit ended up being as hate-filled and cruel, however, and they usually remained at the bottom of the staff hierarchy, just like the other children. Last but not least were the human-born spirits among the staff. Orphans who had either lost their parents to the same curse Inko had fallen victim to, or who had simply stumbled into the spirit world on their own. Yagi spoke with gritted teeth of their tragic stories, and while he didn't mention it explicitly, Inko sensed that he considered each and every human-turned-spirit a failure on his part. After Akatani's return to power, Yagi had continued to oppose him by trying to find lost humans and return them to their realm before Akatani could get his hands on them. He had been successful many times, too, but whenever he hadn't, the humans either ended up as cattle or as spirits at the bathhouse. They mingled with the staff until they had fully turned, at which point they were almost indistinguishable from true-born spirits. Akatani knew and tolerated their presence as long as they worked hard and didn't complain. Ah. And there is truly no way for them to go back home. Yagi sat on the edge of the tub while they waited for the hot water to soak and soften the grime. Once they have forgotten their human name, and with it, all memory of their former life, they lose all reason to go home. After all, why return to a place you cannot remember? Inko gasped when she connected the dots. Bah. Is that why Akatani tried to take your name? The gaunt dragon man nodded. He uses a spell he took from the witch to seal your full name. Only when others know your name and call you by it are the memories kept alive. Anger welled up in Inko. Couldn't he have told her about the importance of keeping her name before? She didn't want to risk losing her memories. What if she forgot about Izuku? How should she help him, then? What if she forgot about being human herself? Upset at Yagi's negligence to tell her, she took a quick run up and headbutted him off the edge into the half-filled tub. There was a splash, and a few seconds later, Yagi re-emerged, hair all drenched and with algae stuck to his intact horn. He gave her a more confused and irritated look. What was that for? Ah. You could have told me sooner. I thought it wasn't as important. Since you told me your full name and your son's, I can always help you remember. But what if something happened to him? Inko clenched her teeth, not wanting to admit how much she depended on the skeletal dragon man to be her voice and hands. He tried to climb out of the tub but slipped and fell back in. Inko took it as a sign that the layer of grime had soaked for long enough. She went to bite into the handle of the mob and drag it over to Yagi. The work Dabi picked out for them was always hard. Absurd, too, sometimes, when he made them clean spots that couldn't be seen or reached by normal means, like scrubbing the rust off the pipes behind the wall panels or dusting off the ceiling. It was always Yagi who was made to work, and it was always Inko who helped him out as best as she could. Whenever they got as much as a minute to breathe, either Midnight or one of the kids dragged them off to rest or eat or simply talk to them. Which was their way of helping, because every single time Dabi had to search the entire bathhouse for them before he could shove another batch of tasks on Yagi and Inko. Due to the amount of work, the day passed quickly. And due to their game of hide and seek, they made it into the evening less exhausted than the day before. Some of the children invited Yagi and Inko to their sleeping rooms to sit with them for a while. They were eager to share their stories, whether they were about their often tragic arrival in the spirit world or something silly that had happened during their workday. At some point, Yagi excused himself and walked out on the balcony, where Kitsuki was sitting away from everyone else. Inko might have lost her translator then, but really, the children just needed someone to listen, and she gladly lent her ear. It was the least she could do for them, after all. From what she gathered, Midnight was the only person who looked after them, and she was more of a big sister than a mother, who had her own work and duties cut out for her. Not to mention that there were quite a lot of attention-starved children, and clearly, not enough adults to properly take care of them. After some of the children had laid down on their futons and the conversation mostly continued among them, Inko got up to see what Kitsuki and Yagi were talking about. When she stuck her head out of the open sliding door, she found the two of them sitting in the corner of the balcony. You know, when I get a chance to sneak into the snake's office, I could grab a train ticket for you as well, Yagi offered to the boy. Thanks, All Might, but you've already done enough for me, Kitsuki replied, head held low and shying the eye contact. There's really no point in you putting your life on the line for me again. Do you not want to return to your parents? The boy scoffed, a sad smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. I've been gone for so long, I'd be surprised if the old hag even remembered me. Besides, she's not gonna take me back looking like this. He slung an arm around his legs and scratched at one of the orange and black rimmed spots on his other arm. Carefully and quietly, Inko walked up to them. At the sound of her hooves on the wood of the balcony, Kitsuki immediately perked up. She bleated softly. A good mother will love her child no matter what they look like. What's she saying? She said that your mother will love you regardless, Yagi repeated for her. Besides, Yoichi is likely able to restore your old form. Kitsuki just avoided their eyes again and chose to stare out at the vast amounts of water below the bathhouse. Can he also make me forget about the shit I've seen in this world? I don't know about that, to be honest. I've never met him myself. Well, forget it. Scoffing, Kitsuki got up and walked back inside. Thanks for the offer, though. And good luck saving the poor sucker the snake abducted this time. Inko concluded quietly once Kitsuki had disappeared around the corner. He remembers, but still chooses to stay. Hopelessness is not a choice, Yagi said, grinding his teeth. It's the environment Akatani has created. He, too, rose from the floor of the balcony. Let's call it a day. On their way back to their room, Yagi quietly told her the story of the salamander boy. Kitsuki had been kidnapped by Akatani shortly before the Dragon Lord's return, and he had been used to lure Yagi into a trap. Kitsuki had been there when Yagi had suffered his big defeat, and Yagi believed that the boy was holding himself in part responsible for his permanently emaciated state. For once, Inko thought his assumption might be right. Following Yagi's defeat, Akatani had kept Kitsuki, much like Izuku, locked in his private quarters, believing him to maybe be the reincarnation of his son, simply due to the slightly reptilian features of Kitsuki's spirit form. Ultimately, however, he had been cast out due to his rebellious nature and the simple fact that, well, he was a salamander spirit, not a dragon. In secret, Inko hoped that Akatani would let Izuku go, too, if he didn't turn into a dragon. And what was the likelihood of that? She'd seen a lot of different spirits, but the only dragons she'd met were Akatani and Yagi, and they weren't even the same kind of dragon spirit. It was hard not to forget the flow of time when every day was filled to the brim with work. Dabi quickly caught on to what the children were doing to keep Yagi and Inko out of his grasp, and to stop him from punishing them, Yagi agreed to an even tighter work schedule and stricter supervision. Thankfully, Dabi was too lazy to watch them all the time, and Inko quickly found other ways to ease their work. It's surprising really, but apparently, the bathhouse staff had never heard of the cleaning properties of lemon juice and vinegar, or that a pinch of salt made water boil a little quicker. In a single week, Inko had revolutionized the work routines of the lower-level staff with her personal experience and simple life hacks from home. Good thing she remembered all the cleaning tips from Dust.Bunny.Wrangler on Metagram. She'd have to show the kids the videos, sometimes. When she had a phone again. And internet. And hands. Goddamn. Sometimes, she was willing to borrow a swear word or two from Kitsuki. She never actually did, though. The children, great as they were, kept their lips sealed when it came to Inko. Her self-awareness and memories being the reason behind many of the small improvements around the bathhouse had become a sort of inside joke that no one of the higher-ranked staff members was let in on. One time, Inko had watched a fire demon talk to Akatani via a pipe on the wall. "Something strange going on down here," he'd said. "The lower-level staff. They've gotten really efficient at cleaning and cooking lately." "Huh? I don't know why that'd be a problem. It's fucking strange, is all. I'm running myself ragged to keep that old dragon occupied. I thought you wanted him to work himself to death, not me." Seeing Dabi so upset and being told off by the snake had made her giggle. Inko's and Yagi's nights were usually short and technically more mornings than nights. Their work schedule didn't give Yagi much room to recover, let alone to regain enough strength to summon his far more powerful form, and when he'd been especially exhausted the late evening before, there was a considerably greater risk of him shifting in his sleep. Inko didn't mind that much. She might even have snuggled up to him once or twice. That was her secret to keep, however. Every single night, Inko dreamed of the tree, and every time, she had to choose whether to go right or left. Unlike the first time, however, she only got to choose one path each night, and sometimes, it was the left one that took her to her son instead of the right one. When her dream ended with Izuku being swept away, she awoke with her heart pounding and a burning determination to get him back. When she dreamed of the blonde teen instead, she awoke very well rested, but a little sluggish. A little over a week, and they had still not gotten a single step closer to reaching Izuku. Until midnight told them of a dinner Akatani was about to hold in the upper levels of the bathhouse to welcome an influential clan of Tengus. It was such a huge deal, apparently, that a lot of preparations had to be made, and Dabi, for some reason, stuck extra close to Yagi and only picked the kind of work that would keep him and Inko as far away from anyone else as possible. They weren't even allowed to know when the event was going to roll around. Clearly, Akatani didn't want them to interfere in any way, and that led to the conclusion that perhaps, hopefully, Izuku would be there. It had been a long and taxing night before, and midday was around the corner when Inko awoke to the sounds of someone slamming the sliding door to the storage room shut. Yagi, who had somehow managed not to shift that night, was on his feet in an instant and reaching for the door frame. The sliding door didn't budge when he pulled. Inko recognized the malicious laugh of the fire demon coming from the corridor outside. Shit. Yagi pulled even harder on the door, but only managed to make it rattle. "Please, try all you want," Dabi said. "I've put a charm on it." "What's going on? Why aren't we allowed outside?" Yagi shouted at him, clenching his fists. "Lord's orders. You've been grounded for today," Dabi just said. "And you'll get me to watch your door. Aren't you lucky to be in good company? Don't even think about shifting forms. If you try to tear down these walls, I'll set fire to the entire floor. You don't want the other staff members to get hurt, do you?" Yagi growled low in response. "You despicable." Inko's blood ran cold. Bah. Izuku, he must be at the dinner right now." That seemed to snap Yagi out of it. Nodding, he turned around and walked to the other end of the room, motioning for Inko to follow him. As quietly as somehow possible, he opened the other sliding door that led out onto the small balcony. It wasn't much of a way out. There was a long, likely deadly drop into the water below, and both sides were closed off by wooden walls reaching from floor to ceiling, and even a little beyond the balcony. Inko saw no way to climb past them onto the balconies of the adjacent rooms. Yagi leaned out over the balcony, then took a few steps back. She gasped. "Bah, you're not going to try and fly, are you?" "Don't be silly," he replied quietly, glanced at her, and changed into his dragon form. "Hey, what's with the silence?" Dabi shouted at them through the closed door. "I got nothing to say to you." Yagi shouted back, lips pulled back into a right snarl. Ah. Get lost. Inko joined in, but Dabi just chuckled in response. Maybe try and keep him occupied until I'm back, Yagi whispered to her and walked up to one of the wooden walls. With his long neck, he managed to peek around it easily, and Inko figured that he was going to try and climb past the wall, using the full length of his dragon form to always keep a part of him on one of the balconies. Ah. Yagi. She held him up just as he was about to lift his upper body onto the railing and beyond. He craned his head back around. Ah. Tell Izuku that I'm okay and that I miss him. I will. The climb looked risky, to say the least. At one point, there was half a dragon on one balcony and half a dragon on the other, and Inko was forced to dodge his tail when he counterbalanced himself. His claws left long scratches on the railing and the wooden wall. She prayed he would be able to fly in case he fell. His feet slipped off the railing, and for a second, his lower half was dangling down the other balcony like a rope on the edge of a cliff. Thankfully, he managed to pull himself up and over, and when the blonde tuft at the end of his tail disappeared from view, Inko dared to breathe a sigh of relief. A few seconds later, a human hand poked out from behind the wall, giving her a brief thumbs up. He'd made it. Plucking up her courage, Inko stomped back over to the door to the corridor. She'd do anything that was necessary to keep Dabi's attention on her. Izuku had thought he would like it better, being outside of Lord Akatani's living quarters. He had expected a chance to finally make a break for it and run, not to get escorted all the way from the elevator to the dining room. When he had taken a step out of line, Akatani had slapped a hand on his shoulder and squeezed it so hard that Izuku had felt the tips of his claws through the cloth of his kimono. In his week and a half stay at the bathhouse, which was decidedly too long already, by the way, Izuku had learned not to resist the Dragon Lord's every order if he wanted to remain unharmed and to see the sunlight at least every once in a while. From the upper level balcony, that was. He was never free to move around Akatani's living quarters as he pleased or to do anything he wanted to do. Either Akatani kept him under strict supervision or he was locked up in his room. Izuku had actually grown to prefer the latter because then, at least, he didn't have to interact with Akatani or to listen to him calling him Mikumo. He was not Mikumo. Over the past days, Izuku had noticed that it took him considerably longer to remember his own full name, like his brain had to go into the basement every time and dust off a couple of old boxes. His mom's first name had already slipped him and he felt horrible about that. It frightened him that he might forget about her and by extension, about wanting to save her from her curse. Izuku had often asked Akatani about her, where she was and whether he could see her. The only answers he had ever gotten were that she was closer than he thought and that he shouldn't worry because she was well within his Akatani's grasp. By chance, Izuku had overheard Akatani and one of his henchmen talk about a sheep moving freely about the bathhouse, which hadn't seemed like something Akatani would usually allow. Although he had no way of knowing, Izuku hoped that it was his mom and that she was well. Sitting next to Akatani at a ridiculously long dining table, Izuku scratched at the base of his horns again. The stupid little prongs were still growing. His ears had recently begun changing too and were now well on their way to be described as floppy. There was some sort of white fuzz growing on them as well. Izuku did not know what mental strength kept him from freaking out about the changes, but he had cried some when he discovered the horns and had been in a constant state of discomfort since. And that was, by far, not the worst part about the changes. Every morning, Akatani came around to squeeze his cheeks and turn his head this way and that to take stock of his features. Although neither his horns or ears looked anything like Akatani's, the Dragon Lord could not be convinced that Izuku would turn into anything else but a dragon. He was that delusional. The return of my precious son, Akatani said and raised a cup of sake to his guests at the far end of the table. The Tengu with the black wings and the beak mask, at least, Izuku thought it was a mask, returned the gesture, though his eyes remained cold and calculating. His companions followed his example. Izuku pointedly avoided the eye contact with any of the men, seeing how all of them radiated a different kind of evil. He couldn't help but feel like a trophy or prize pet put on display next to the Dragon Lord, all dressed up in an expensive kimono. Just when would he be able to escape? The door in the back of the room opened. He looked up to see a number of Akatani's faithful servants enter the room holding plates of food above their heads. Some of them Izuku had seen before, since they had been allowed to talk to Akatani in his office while Izuku had been around. A shiver ran down his spine when he spotted the blonde girl with the large fangs and the twitching spider legs sticking out of her hair. She had gotten all grabby when she had been up in Akatani's office and the Dragon Lord had turned his back to them once. All but literally drooling over Izuku, she had called him so cute she could eat him right up. Izuku was still not sure how he'd survived that encounter. Akatani's most trusted servants were all psychos, bootlickers, mindless puppets, or a combination of the above, judging by what Izuku had observed thus far. At the very end of the line of servants streaming into the room, there was one figure that didn't fit in with the rest. A very tall, very sickly-looking man carrying a teapot. And as if he didn't stand out enough already, there were 1.5 horns poking out of his wild mane of hair and a white tail with a blonde tuft stuck out from under his haori. Izuku couldn't believe his eyes. Were there 3 different dragons in the same town? But his draconic features looked different from Akatani's, and despite of his practically skeletal appearance and dark eyes, the lack of claws and scales made him seem a lot less threatening. Izuku started at the noise of Akatani crushing his cup of sake in his hand. At the sight of the man, the Dragon Lord's eyes had turned into slits and the corner of his mouth pulled back to reveal his pointed teeth. "Yagi," he growled low. "Is something the matter?" The Tengu at the other end of the table asked. Akatani regained his composure surprisingly quickly, though his smile couldn't have been any faker. "Forgive me," he replied to his guest and let the remaining shards of his sake cup drop from his hand. There wasn't even a scratch on his scaled palm. "I was just reminded of an encounter with a certain bull-headed moron." The Tengu turned around to the servants. "You have another dragon serving you? That's quite impressive." "He came to me of his own volition," Akatani boasted. While pouring tea for the Tengu, the other dragon shot Akatani a deadly glare. Despite of his frail-looking body, his eyes shone with incredible strength. The servants continued to set the table with dishes and the finest variety of sushi, while Akatani kept going on about his superior intelligence and influence. To be honest, Izuku had stopped listening the instant Akatani had opened his mouth again and was just waiting, impatiently, for the other dragon Yagi, was that his name? To pass by and pour him a cup of tea. Izuku didn't think he'd ever met this man before, though somehow, he felt like Yagi might be the first person he could trust besides the Golden Dragon. At the very least, Yagi seemed ready to rebel against Akatani's rule, and that was something Izuku could relate to. When he finally walked around the table to offer tea to Izuku and Akatani like another servant had offered water to them before, Akatani raised a hand to stop Yagi. "My son does not wish for tea," he said. Izuku pushed his empty cup to the edge of the table. "I do, actually." He could feel Akatani's glare on them, but it seemed that in company of his business partners, the Dragon Lord didn't want to start a fight. Still, Izuku didn't look directly at Yagi in fear of Akatani's punishment if he were to start a conversation with the other dragon. When Yagi poured him a cup of tea, he bowed down deeply until they were almost at the same eye level. Izuku Midoriya. Although the name was but a whisper from the gaunt dragon's mouth, all of a sudden, the slowly descending fog in Izuku's mind dispersed. "Your mother wants to let you know that she is well and that she misses you." A tear rose to Izuku's eye when he suddenly remembered. Inko was his mother's name. She had a kind smile, dark green hair, green eyes like his, and she used to pull Izuku into a tight hug whenever he had felt sad or frightened. At those times, they had cried a river together, but he'd always felt better afterward. His heart was flooded with relief to know that she was fine. "I miss her, too." The quiet words spilled from Izuku's mouth almost by themselves. When he dared to glance at Yagi, the man was smiling at him broadly, and Izuku found new strength and hope in Yagi's confidence and optimism. "Try not to scratch at them. It'll make it worse, trust me." Was Yagi talking about his horns? But how would he know? Izuku was sure he hadn't been scratching since Yagi had entered the room. "That's quite enough," Akatani said in a very strict voice. He meant it literally. Izuku's teacup was overflowing. By a lot. Uttering a quiet apology, Yagi wiped the spilled tea off the table with the sleeve of his haori and took a few steps back. "Their presence is no longer required." The Dragon Lord dismissed him, and though Yagi obliged reluctantly, he left with the other servants. Izuku couldn't help but stare after him. The man had known his name. He knew his mom, too, and he had empathized with Izuku. If he had to have a self-proclaimed dragon dad, was it too much to ask to trade the current one for another? Bah. You know, I think you're just so mean because someone hurt you once and you've gotten it into your mind that hurting everyone around you would be just. For fuck's sake, make the sheep shut up, Yagi. Through the sliding door, Inko could make out the demon's shadow and the glow of the flames dancing about Dabi's horns. He was sitting across the corridor with his back to the wall. For a couple of minutes already, she'd been freely theorizing about Dabi's nature, trying to drag up anything he probably wouldn't want to hear about himself or straight up lecturing him on his behavior. Which, of course, she'd never have the courage to do if he could actually understand her. For all she knew, she was just annoying him with her sheep noises. Bah. Ba. Ba. It is not just. It just makes you a big bully. A jerk. What? It's not like Inko didn't know any swear words, but she could hardly ever bring herself to use them, even when Izuku wasn't around. Itsuki would probably have a few choice words for Dabi. And, come to think of it, he was a lot like Inko's old school friend Mitsuki in that regard and a few others. With her hot-headed temper, Mitsuki had saved Inko more than once when she hadn't been able to stand up for herself. Like that time her classmates had scared her with ghost stories during their field trip to Yakushima. She wondered what had become of Mitsuki. They had gotten out of touch sometime after Inko had met Hisashi. Wait a second. Yakushima. That tree that kept appearing in her dreams, could it be one of the cedars she had seen on their field trip back then? But why would that be relevant now? Inko got a little lost in thought as she tried hard to remember the tales her classmates had told about the forest, but the only thing she recalled was crying over something. She had always wept easily and, well, 20-something years had passed since. Her memory was allowed to be a little fuzzy. Okay, I've had it with the bleeding. That sheep's toast. Inko snapped out of her thoughts just in time to see Dobby's shadow move. The bluish light of a flame shone bright through the door's paper. Ice-cold fear seized Inko's heart. There was a ripping sound when Dobby tore the paper charm off the doorframe. He slid the door just far enough back to stick his madly grinning face through. His look fell on Inko, and his eyes shone with murderous intent. There you are. Inko took a few steps backwards, painfully aware that there was only the balcony behind her. Dobby had noticed it, too. And something else. The grin slipped from his face. Wait a fucking minute. Where's Yagi? Almost panicked, he pushed Inko aside, ran straight to the balcony and looked out over the railing. Damn it. I was told he couldn't fly. Where is he? Meanwhile, Inko was frozen with fear. The way out was open. All she had to do was run. Yet her shaking legs refused to move. Literally fuming from the corners of his mouth, Dobby turned around to her. You're not just a sheep, are you? Have you been trying to distract me this whole time? Well, I'll be damned if I let a sheep make a fool out of me. The smirk that formed on his face spelled lethal danger. A blue flame ignited in his palm as he began to walk towards Inko. Akatani told me not to harm you, but I'm sure he'll forgive me if I roast a leg or two. With sheer force of will, Inko fought her own fear and managed to slowly back away from Dobby into the corridor. Dobby stretched out his hand towards her. Flames danced about his fingers, growing both hotter and higher. Inko. As if on cue, Yagi came sliding into the corridor from around a corner. At a glance, he had assessed the situation, ran towards them, grabbed a bucket someone had left in the corridor, and hurled it at Dobby. Taken by surprise, Dobby was too late to react. Dirty water splashed into his face, temporarily extinguishing the fire surrounding his horns. The bucket followed a split second later, hitting him square in the head. Dobby staggered back and stopped moving, save for his fingers, which still twitched with the desire to kill. Finally, the spell on Inko was broken and she ran to Yagi, hoping that he'd run, too. But he didn't. Yagi grabbed a broom from a room next to him and took a fighting stance. Even though Inko was clueless how he was going to defend them with a cleaning utensil, she sought cover behind him. Like a puppet on loose strings, Dobby slumped forward. A second of eerie silence passed before the fire on his horns reignited, burning brighter than before. He raised his head again, grinning madly. Congratulations. Today you die. Dobby held out a hand towards them, and flames ignited all around his wrist. Before he could release the fire, Yagi had taken 2 quick steps towards him and smacked the demon's outstretched hand away using the end of the broomstick. Dobby's flames singed the ceiling. Thankfully, the corridor wasn't set ablaze instantly, but Inko could feel the fire's heat grazing her. Hey Dobby. What are you doing, messing around with the NPCs? Both Yagi and Dobby froze in a fighting stance. The annoyed-sounding voice came from a teen at the other end of the corridor, with off-white hair and cracked skin. His spirit form features were that of a white fox. Of a white fox that had been hit by a car, judging by his scars and the ruffled fur of his 2 tails. The yellow glowing eyes of another, dark and nebulous spirit, shone from his shadow. Sensei wants to see you. Akatani can wait, Dobby responded, not taking his eyes off Yagi. He said he wants to see you ASAP, the teen added and scratched at his neck. Sensei's gonna loot your dead body if you're not up there in 10. With great effort, Dobby wrestled his anger back under control. He huffed smoke at Yagi and with a last deadly glare, turned around to walk up to the fox spirit. The living shadow to the feet of the fox spirit expanded until it filled the end of the corridor, the 2 henchmen disappeared and the shadow with them as well. Seconds later, Inko still found herself staring at the spot where they had last been standing. Her legs were still shaking. Ko? She only noticed that Yagi had come back when he knelt down in front of her. He sounded out of breath, but his eyes shone with concern. Are you alright? Did you get hurt? In response, she shook her head, but when the tension and the scare finally let go of her, it was too much for her poor heart to handle. She would have bawled her eyes out right there, if only she could cry. In her plight, all she could do was to firmly close her eyes, shake her head even harder and pray for tears. It's okay. Everything's fine now. The hand at the base of her neck guided her to step closer to Yagi until she was pressing her head against his chest. It wasn't comfortable to feel his ribs and sternum, but it was oh so comforting to be held, and she thought she actually felt a tear or two run down her cheeks. He gave her the time she needed to calm down. "I figured he'd try to hurt you if I stayed away for too long," he said. When she found a strength in her limbs again, Inko took a step back from him. "Bah. Did you find Izuku?" Yagi nodded. "Akatani was too close for me to grab him and run, but I was able to restore his name to him and pass along your message." She supposed she couldn't have expected more than that. "Bah. How is he?" "Holding up very well, considering the circumstances. I can tell he's got a strong soul." "Ah. And is he, you know?" He sighed, reluctant to answer that question. "He is changing. But that was to be expected, considering the time he spent in this realm." Inko studied his expression, trying to read all the details from it that he was withholding. It didn't work. "Bah. Bah bah. Changing into what? Into a dragon?" Yagi opened his mouth to reply, then shut it again. Oh god. That was not a good sign. "There's a few different ways to interpret his features," Yagi said eventually, which really didn't help. Inko took a couple of steps back from him and let her gaze drop to the floor while her mind put together the worst nightmare imaginable. Bah. Izuku can't be. What if Akatani was right? "Inko, hey. Look at me." His hand on her cheek brought her mind back into the present, and for a split second, she was even reminded of that scene in her dream, except that Yagi's blue eyes stared back at her from the shadow of the teen's face. Izuku might be turning into a dragon, but that doesn't mean he's Akatani's long-lost son. From what I've seen, Izuku was still resisting him even before I restored his memory. He wouldn't do that if there was even a trace of Mikumo in him. It didn't take much experience with Akatani's moods for Izuku to understand that the meeting hadn't gone well. The Dragon Lord had shoved him out of the elevator and into his living quarters. Once again, a door closed behind him. Izuku had to face the fact that he had failed to run when he had the chance. Akatani went a few steps ahead and glanced back at him. Anger was burning in his eyes. "You will not speak to this other dragon ever again," he said. "But I didn't," Izuku meekly complained. "And if he speaks to you, you will not reply to him. Am I clear?" Izuku avoided Akatani's eyes. "Yagi just wanted to help me." That got the Dragon Lord's full attention. "He wants to help you in all the wrong ways," he claimed. "If you needed something, you'd only have to ask me." Izuku would rather jump off the balcony than to ask his kidnapper for advice. "Besides, you don't even understand what I'm going through." "Excuse me?" Akatani raised an eyebrow at him, looking offended, as though Izuku had implied that Yagi was better than him at something. I mean, what is it? Out with it. This is it." Izuku shouted back at the Dragon Lord and grabbed at his horns. He might have pulled if they hadn't been firmly connected to his skull. "All that stuff that's happening to me. It's weird. And scary. Do you have any idea what that feels like?" Instead of an instant reply, a surprisingly long moment of silence followed. Eventually, Izuku let go of his horns and dared to look back up at Akatani, who wore a hard-to-read expression. "No," he admitted eventually. "I was born a spirit. And so were you, Mikumo. But I'm not a spirit right now," Izuku argued. I don't know what I am. But I think Yagi knows what that's like." Mentioning the other dragon's name again was a mistake Izuku realized too late. Akatani's eye twitched and his features tensed again. "You will still not speak to him. Go to your room now. I have much work to do." Of course, even though Akatani let him go to Mikumo's room by himself, he still accompanied Izuku to make sure the door was firmly locked. Interestingly, however, there was shouting to be heard a little while later, loud enough that Izuku could hear Akatani's roars from his office, even through the closed door and the hallway between the room. "You had one job. One job." Curiosity drove Izuku to press his ear to the wall so he could try to listen to the reply of his servant. "It's not my fault. I was told the old dragon was too weak to jump off the balcony and fly. He is too weak. I would have noticed had he regained his energy. And even then, it was still your job to make sure he doesn't leave that room. They tricked me." "Oh? They?" Akatani had lowered his voice to a barely audible level. Whatever was happening to Izuku's ears was probably the reason he was still able to listen in. "Yes, they. That sheep's not normal. It's like Yagi trained it or something." "Are you seriously trying to tell me you were unable to lock up this emaciated, pathetic husk of a dragon because of a sheep?" There was a moment of tense silence. "That's a new low even for you," Akatani declared. "Let me be perfectly clear. I want Yagi dead before the end of the next week. But not just dead. I want him at his absolute lowest before he dies. I want him crawling on the floor before me like the wretched worm that he is when I stomp out his lights." "What about the sheep? Can't we kill the sheep, at least?" "No." Akatani barked at him. "Wasn't I clear when we talked about this before? I need the sheep as leverage before Mikumo has fully turned and forgotten about his old life." Izuku's chest tightened in fear. There was a deadline. If he didn't escape before his changes were complete, then Dabi would kill his mom and the friendly old dragon who tried to help him. Although Yagi had been convinced that the business meeting had gone well and that Akatani would have to leave soon if he wanted to seal his alliance with the Tengu clan, almost another week went by without a chance to meet Izuku again. Dabi was soon back from his meeting with Akatani and in a disturbingly good mood, too, like he had a whole bunch of new torture methods up his sleeve and was just waiting for the right opportunity to deploy them. Inko had expected that the snake had given him a stern talking to, but it seemed more like Akatani and Dabi had been plotting something. And that made her feel very uneasy. Since his return, Dabi had made an effort to stick around more often, which forced Inko to restrain herself from helping Yagi to keep up her simple-minded sheep act. She also didn't like the scrutinizing looks the fire demon gave her. There was a murderous intent in his eyes that Yagi had noticed as well. Even while working, he always kept an eye on Dabi, and more than once the tension between them grew so bad that Inko had worried it would come to a scuffle. Needless to say, Dabi's presence and personal supervision raised the pressure and put even more strain on Yagi. One time, Kitsuki came by and managed to get Dabi off their backs for a while by faking an emergency somewhere else in the bathhouse. The Salamander boy's help had been brilliant, effective, and most of all, appreciated at the time, but later, when Dabi found out he'd been tricked, Yagi had to step in to save Kitsuki from the demon's wrath. Had it not been for Midnight intervening and using her magic to put all three of them to sleep at the last second, Yagi and Dabi would have fought and hurt each other for real. After that, Yagi made Kitsuki promise not to help them again, and Inko agreed. They couldn't risk the children getting hurt, even if the work was hard on the old dragon. What kept Yagi going was a brightly burning spark of justice and determination, fueled by his anger at Akatani and Dabi. Inko had seen the light in Yagi's eyes, unyielding and strong. The rest they were getting certainly didn't help much. Any sleep they got likely aligned with the sleep Dabi was getting, and he seemed to be okay with just a couple of hours. Well, he didn't work much, after all. Inko could tell that Yagi was starting to reach a breaking point because every night since he had met Izuku, he shifted into his dragon form in his sleep. Sometimes, he didn't even coil around her, but ended up sprawled awkwardly in the too small room by morning. She worried for him especially when he failed to shift back into his human form immediately after he'd woken up. Her dreams had begun to change, too. When Inko was running around the tree towards Izuku now, her poor boy was growing fangs and horns and a tail as she got closer. His horns were more like small, bright blue antlers, and his tail, at least according to her imagination, was white-furred like Yagi's, but with fluffy-looking green hair at the end. It didn't matter to her what her son looked like. She just wanted to save him, even more desperately than before. Yet the river was not to be stopped, and Izuku was always swept away before she could reach him. The nights Inko didn't suffer the nightmare, she dreamed of the middle schooler basking in the summer sun. Some of the shadows had lifted from his face, and she had been dumbstruck by how much he resembled a much younger, perfectly healthy, and completely human version of Yagi. All the while, the feeling that she'd seen him before, at a time long past, kept growing and irritating her. The image of the teen didn't seem like something her imagination had created. Still, every time she felt like his full name was right on the tip of her tongue, she transformed back into a sheep and teenage Yagi comforted her until she fell back asleep. She never found the courage to tell the real Yagi about her bizarre dreams. Whatever they meant, one thing became clear. Their time was running out. Something had to happen very soon, or Inko was afraid one of her loved ones would reach a state there was no coming back from. Since Yagi had returned his name to him, Izuku had a much easier time hanging on to his memories. Even as Lord Akatani had sat him down and told him stories of what he still claimed to be Izuku's previous life, even as he kept referring to him by Mikumo day and night, Izuku held tight onto his and his mother's name. He had already forgotten the name of his biological father again, but that man hadn't exactly scored points for likability when he had returned after 12 years and immediately fought with his mom over the rights to their apartment, so Izuku was pretty okay with any memories of him fading away. Regarding his self-proclaimed new father, Izuku had recently noticed an interesting peculiarity during the many interactions he had been forced into. Mentioning Yagi's name and Akatani's presence didn't just upset the Dragon Lord, it also triggered some sort of desire to surpass the other dragon in every way imaginable. For example, Izuku had once claimed that Yagi would probably cook for Izuku himself instead of having servants prepare their meal, and, sure enough, at the next dinner, Akatani had presented to him a bowl of ramen he had prepared himself. Or claimed to have prepared himself, at least. It hadn't tasted much different than usual, to be honest, and Izuku had wondered whether Akatani might have failed so horribly at the task that he'd given up and just claimed the kitchen's work as his own. Whatever the case, there was an absurd, one-sided rivalry going on between Yagi and Akatani, and Izuku was certain he could use that to his advantage somehow. Somehow being the key word, since Izuku hadn't formulated a foolproof escape plan yet. His last escape attempt, which had involved climbing down from the balcony using a makeshift rope, had only landed him for a whole day and night locked up in Mikumo's room again. Technically speaking, being separated from Akatani for so long should give him plenty of time to come up with a much better plan, and he might have thought one up already if only his body would stop bothering him with growing pains in places that should not feel like this. A week had passed since Izuku had met Yagi, and during this time his ears had reached a final state of definitely floppy, with a fine layer of fur on the outside and very soft scales on the inside. They twitched every time Izuku picked up a sound, which he still hadn't gotten to. Only a few days back, Izuku's canines had also turned sharper. They hadn't even fallen out like when he'd lost his milk teeth, they had just changed. Akatani had been overjoyed to find out. Izuku hadn't. For an entire day, he'd run around with aching teeth and refused to eat because of it. And would you know it? He hadn't begun to fade again by sunset. Akatani had lied to him about that. Still, there seemed to be something of a rule to the changes Izuku was experiencing. His discomfort was always greatest just before they happened, and the pressure that had slowly built along his lower back boded ill. Very ill. Inko and Yagi were getting new cleaning tokens from midnight when Akatani's messenger boy, the Kitsune Tamura, approached them. "Sensei wants to see you," he said to Yagi. In return, Yagi gave him a wary look. "What for?" "No," Tamura replied and scratched at his neck like he often did, looking nervous. "Seems urgent." "All rivers in one, summoning him because of an emergency." That didn't sound right. Yagi imagined the old snake would rather eat his own tail than to request help from him. Next to him, Inko let out a soft bleat. "Izuku," she said quietly. Yagi prayed it wasn't about Izuku. He was tired and exhausted, and his old injury was all but killing him, but if Akatani had hurt Inko's boy, Yagi swore he'd find the strength in him to kill that snake. Even if he had to use his weak dragon form and bite off Akatani's head like some rabid animal. He returned the cleaning tokens to Midnight. "Please keep Inko safe until I'm back," he said to her. "Don't let Dabi anywhere near her." "You're really going to answer that summon?" Midnight asked, looking worried. "It could be a trap." Come on," Tamura exclaimed impatiently. "I'll get punished if I stay AFK for too long." Yagi glanced at him. That boy was speaking in a strange tongue as usual, but he got the idea. "I'll take the risk," he said to Midnight before he turned to Tamura. "Take me to him." "Good, finally. Kuro, do your thing." As the misty darkness of the Inenra enveloped Tamura and Yagi, Inko made an attempt to run up to him, but luckily Midnight stopped her. Yagi gave the human-turned sheep a thumbs up and a hopeful smile. It wasn't enough to calm her worries, he knew, but he had to try at least. Within mere seconds, Yagi found himself back in Akatani's office with Tamura and Kuro. No sooner had the darkness dispersed that Akatani was upon them and shooing Tamura out of the door by waving his arms at the teen. Out with you." "Sensei." "Get out, I said." Tamura stumbled out of the office towards the elevator and Akatani all but slammed the double doors shut behind him. Nana and Gran had often pointed out to Yagi that he could be a bit thick and oblivious at times, but there was something strange going on here, plain as day. It wasn't just the way Akatani's movement spoke indeed of urgency. He was also still dressed in the yukata he'd likely been wearing for the night. Akatani turned around to him and straightened his posture, as if that would do anything to cover up his apparent distress. Yagi couldn't help but smirk. Oh, this was good. Better than good. Glorious. "Wipe that grin off your face before I do it for you," the snake growled. Yagi remained unimpressed. "But you need my help, don't you?" "Shut up." Yagi was soaking up the snake's sour mood like a dry sponge. He hadn't even known he was able to bask in someone else's misfortune like that, but hey, this was the man who'd killed his mentor and 100 other spirits and humans. If he couldn't beat him again, Yagi at least wished a world of misery upon him. Wearing a grim expression, Akatani motioned for him to follow. "Come." Yagi's good mood quickly began to falter when Akatani led him to Mikumo's room. Inko had been right. The emergency was about Izuku. Akatani unlocked the door for them, stepped in and waited until Yagi had entered as well before he closed and locked it again. It didn't take long for Yagi to spot both the boy and the problem. Izuku was sitting on the tiled floor next to the round bed in the back of the room, with his back to the wall, arms on his knees and face hidden in his hands. A steady stream of big bubbly tears was flowing out from between his fingers. The reason for them? Likely the dragon's tail he'd grown overnight. It was white furred on top, green scaled on the underside, and equipped with a tuft the same color and quality as Izuku's hair. "Izuku." As Yagi tried to rush towards Inko's boy, Akatani stopped him by holding out his hand in front of Yagi's chest and shooting him a glare. "Do not call him by this name. You've done enough damage as it is." "The boy is having a panic attack," Yagi argued. This wasn't the time to squabble about Izuku's identity. I have two eyes. I can see that much, Akatani replied. He's been completely unresponsive since. But gods. Akatani had been trying to help Izuku. What did you do? I was just trying to tell him how happy he should be that he'll be able to shift completely soon. Well, congrats, you old snake. You made it worse. Yagi pushed Akatani's arm out of his way. What do you even know about human-born spirits? All I know is that Mikumo wouldn't be in this state if you hadn't restored the memories of his human life. Loud sobs coming from Izuku interrupted their dispute. Akatani pulled an annoyed face at the sound and withdrew from the circular room. Knock when you fixed him, he said. Fix him? Turning into a spirit isn't something that Yagi's argument fell on deaf ears. Once Akatani had locked him in with Izuku, all he could do was huff in anger and redirect his attention to the problem at hand. Yagi approached Inko-san. His intuition had been right from the start. He was turning into a dragon spirit. But the amount of fur over scales indicated that his spirit form was linked to the earth rather than water, much like his own. Definitely not Mikumo, then. Izuku had just gotten unlucky to roughly fit the age and spirit form of the snake son. Sighing, Yagi knelt down next to the boy. Hey Izuku. Remember me? From the dinner? He pointed at himself and put on a smile, trying to make himself the least frightening as somehow possible. Hopefully, he'd left a decent first impression on the kid the other time they had met. To his surprise, Izuku's crying and sobs quickly began to let up. He wiped his tears away with the sleeves of his kimono and before Yagi could say any more, the boy was suddenly on his feet and threw his arms around Yagi's neck. You came. You actually came. Any more tears, he cried at that moment into Yagi's haori were tears of relief. Still a little perplexed by how quickly Izuku had recovered, Yagi wasn't really sure how to respond. Of course I did. Everything's going to be fine now, he said and gently rubbed the boy's back until his tears had dried up completely. Izuku took a step back and nearly tripped over his new tail. Yagi caught him by his arm and kept him from falling. Please help me get out of here, Izuku implored with his small hands balled into fists. I need to see my mom. So? You didn't call for help because of the tail. I had a scare and I screamed when I came to this morning. Akatani came running immediately. For once, he'd actually tried to calm me down and I eventually did, but I figured if I kept crying, maybe he'd stress out and get you to help, so I kept thinking about the day our neighbor's dog died and along with a flood of words, the waterworks started up again. Either something really horrible had happened to that dog or Izuku cried very easily. Hopefully, it was the latter. In any case, Yagi was very impressed by this family's ability to withstand the spirit realm's trials. Now. Yagi placed a hand on the kid's shoulder to snap him out of that memory and smiled at him. I'm just glad to hear that you're I'm not okay, Izuku added, sniffling, but I'm holding up. Of course. Yagi kept grinning like he hadn't been about to claim the opposite and lowered his voice a little. Your mom and I are working on getting you out. It looks like Akatani is about to leave the bathhouse very soon. If you can hold out until then, we'll come to get you. Even if we have to tear down the walls for it. You really know my mom? How's she? She's wonderful. One of the bravest and most caring humans I've ever met. Practically adopted the whole lot of the bathhouse children since she can't take care of you right now. She reminds me of my mentor, in a few ways. Izuku blinked at him like that hadn't been the answer he had expected. Yagi tried again. Also, she's still a sheep. The boy's gaze fell to the floor. But I'm working on it, Yagi added quickly. Literally. He was literally working for it. Izuku's mood didn't seem to lift. What about the golden dragon? Do you know him? Could you tell him where we are? He tried to save us when we came to this world. Yagi chuckled awkwardly. He knows where you are and he's waiting for an opportunity to make his move, just as we do. Seemingly disappointed, Izuku paced a few steps away, dragging his tail with him. It was obvious that he couldn't move it yet, neither subconsciously nor consciously. I know things aren't looking good right now, Yagi began anew, and I'm sorry there isn't a whole lot I can do for you at this moment, but he was racking his brain, trying to remember what turning into a spirit had been like for him. Nana and Gran had helped him, that was for sure, but how? When he'd been a teen in the middle of transforming into a dragon spirit, he'd suffered a small heart attack every time his tail had brushed something. Nana had to have put an end to that before he'd broken all of the pottery around her mansion. I can help you with this, Yagi said, nodding at Izuku's tail. He showed Inko's boy how to tie the tufted tip to his waist, using the sash of his kimono, so that the appendage wouldn't get in the way of his feet and or brush things on accident. If Izuku was anything like Yagi, he'd have full control over it by the end of the day. Izuku looked down at himself, seemingly unsure what to make of Yagi's measures. He wondered whether he should tell the kid that Akatani had been right and that it would only take another 2 days or so before he'd shift fully. Nana had kept Yagi deliberately in the dark and waking up a full dragon had been a nasty surprise. Then again, Yagi's plan was still to get Izuku and Inko to Yoichi before Izuku's spirit form was complete. He chose to stay optimistic and not risk to scare Izuku. The knock on the door caught their attention. Akatani was growing impatient. "What's taking so long?" "We were just done talking," Yagi replied and rose from the floor with aching joints. He'd been kneeling for quite some time to stay close to Izuku's eye level. A small hand tugged at the hem of his sleeve. "Please, don't leave," Izuku said, eyes fixed on the door handle. Yagi's heart ached at the sight. He'd stay if he could, but there was no way Akatani would allow it. Moreover, he had to go back to Inko before Dabi was getting murderous tendencies again. "What is this?" Akatani asked upon entering the room and taking a glance at Izuku with his tail bound to his waist. "Would you rather have him drag it across the floor until he's able to move it?" Yagi responded in a flat tone of voice. Akatani pinched the bridge of his nose like he was suffering an acute headache. He waved Yagi over. "Come here. I have an offer to make you." "What kind of offer?" "Can't he stay?" Izuku complained meekly. "No, he cannot," Akatani answered harshly. "And you are still grounded, by the way." Reluctantly, Yagi left the room, but not without looking back at Izuku once more before Akatani closed and locked the door behind him. He'd come back to get Izuku out. And if he had to sacrifice this broken body for it, he'd do it. "I have a special task for you," Akatani said to him. "I want you to take care of the boiler in the basement. If you can keep the fire in the furnace lit until tomorrow evening, I'll turn the sheep back into a human for you." "What's the catch?" Yagi asked. "The work's especially taxing." "Of course it is." A smirk played about Akatani's lips. "If you don't want to, you don't have to do it, but then it'll be another week before I can release your sheep friend from her curse." "We agreed to 3 weeks originally. You just added another," Yagi pointed out. "Not that it was of any use. Either work in the boiler room or scrub tubs for another week. It's your choice." The 3-week deadline had been set with a purpose, Yagi realized. Their contract had been meant to end after Izuku had fully shifted into a spirit, and now Akatani was tempting him with an earlier deadline, hoping he'd finally work himself to death. Well, so far Akatani and Dabi had failed to break him, and Yagi wasn't planning on giving in soon, either. "Fine, I'll do it," Yagi begrudgingly agreed. "Let me just get the sheep and I'll start right away." "The sheep stays where it is," Akatani demanded. "No one but the boilerman is allowed in the basement." Yagi ground his teeth, a low growl escaping his throat. From the palm of Akatani's hand rose a paper figure, roughly shaped like a bird with a very long tail. A simplified red eye was drawn on its body that seemed to glow and move by magic. The paper figure hovered in the air between them, making jittery movements. "This'll show you the way down," Akatani explained. When Yagi left to follow the paper figure to the elevator, he might have knocked over one of Akatani's decorative vases with a not-so-subconscious flick of his tail. The paper figure led Yagi to a lower level of the bathhouse and eventually disappeared between 2 wooden wall panels, revealing a hidden sliding door. Beyond lay a dimly lit staircase that led down into the basement and eventually, the boiler room. 3 of its tall walls lay hidden behind equally tall cabinets with numerous small drawers. More paper figures like the one that had been guiding Yagi were flying around, carrying herbs and roots from the drawers to a cluster of cauldrons and pipes atop a huge clay furnace next to the remaining wall. The paper of the enchanted figures seemed to stretch as needed, often turning them into streamers. A few of them had gathered around what looked like a pile of coal that had fallen from a chute, and some more were swirling around a lone figure sitting cross-legged on a small platform in front of the cauldrons. The man eventually stopped directing the paper streamers with his gestures and turned around to Yagi. His clothes looked like an odd cross between a shinobi's and a priest's, and he wore an eye patch over his right eye. "More importantly, however, you're human," Yagi said, surprised to find a full-grown man in the basement of the bathhouse who had neither faded nor turned. "Do you always state the obvious?" the man replied in a tired voice. "I was just wondering why I'm still human." The man completed for him, got up from where he'd been sitting and jumped down the platform to Yagi's level. All the while, the paper streamers kept swirling around him. Some of them momentarily latched onto his upper arms or settled around his shoulders, even. "That, exactly," Yagi replied. "I was born with something called the Eye of the Dead," the man explained and shoved his hands into the folds on his pants. "It allows me to see the spirit world from the world of the living, and vice versa. Apparently, it also keeps me safe from this world's influence on the human body, but that's more of a side effect." "How did you end up working for Akatani, then?" Yagi kept inquiring. "Not by choice. I entered the spirit realm while investigating a series of disappearances in the Akishima forests a few years ago. Akatani caught me and kept me because I'm useful to him." "These things," he said and pulled one of the paper streamers loose that had attached itself to his shoulders, "keep me from leaving the basement if I try to escape. Can't get rid of them, either." The Akishima forests rang a bell for Yagi. You weren't by any chance looking into the disappearance of a boy named Kitsuki Bakugo? I did, the man replied. If Yagi's guess surprised him, he didn't let on. He had been the ninth to disappear into the spirit realm from the Akishima area. Yagi gave him a big grin, happy to have found a brother in arms in an unlikely place. Well, would you know it? I had been trying to return the boy to the human realm. Did you succeed? Unfortunately not, no, Yagi admitted with a heavy heart. The man seemingly recognized him as an equal and offered a hand in greeting. Shota Izawa. Yagi. I feel like I've heard that name before. Did you disappear from the Akishima forests as well? Yagi shook his head. I wouldn't remember even if I tried. I see. Thoughtful silence settled between them for a moment. Only the bubbling and hissing of the cauldrons and pipes filled the room, as well as the whooshing sounds of paper streamers zipping past to prepare the infusions. So, why did you come here? Shota asked. Spirits aren't usually allowed down in the basement. I'm trying to work off a human's debt. Akatani sent me to keep the furnace fed until tomorrow evening. Shota turned to look at the paper figures hovering around the pile of coal. Now that explains why these little bastards suddenly refused to carry the coal. Now that Yagi's attention was drawn to the furnace, he noticed that its flames burned a little low to properly heat the water. Unexpectedly, Shota turned around and began to walk back to the platform he'd been sitting on. Let the fire die and leave now. It's not worth the pain. Excuse me? Shota paused. He glanced back at Yagi first, then at the pile of coal. Do you know why spirits aren't allowed in the boiler room? That coal's made from negative karma. All the impurities they wash off the nature spirits up there are dried and compressed here. If you get into contact with that stuff, even if only with the dust, you'll get tainted. It'll sap your spirit energy. He raised his eyes to Yagi again. And no offense, but you look like you don't have a whole lot of energy to spare. Yagi ground his teeth and pulled up the sleeves of his Haori. Then I am here to prove both you and Akatani wrong, he claimed. There's 2 humans up there who haven't fully turned yet and they are counting on me to get them back home. Shota raised an eyebrow. That's illogical. Feeding the furnace isn't going to save them and Akatani rarely keeps his word. You'll die down here for nothing. But going up against Akatani was no option right now and Yagi had to do something. His conversation with Izuku earlier had only made it painfully clear again how powerless he truly was. He'd done nothing to help Inko's boy escape Akatani's clutches and that weighed on his conscience. With determined steps, Yagi walked up to the pile of coal. Looking a little alarmed, Shota made an attempt to follow him, but the streamers that had already wrapped around his limbs, plus a few that came flying, held him back. I will not die here. Yagi exclaimed with conviction, reached into the pile and grabbed a piece of coal with all his strength. To his surprise, however, it was neither terribly heavy nor did it hurt to touch it. It just burned and itched a little, as if he'd brushed stinging nettles. That's not so bad, he said. You're an idiot. A kind-hearted idiot, but an idiot all the same. Shota sounded disgruntled. It'll get worse quickly. Lots of spirits lost their lives to this task before Akatani locked me down here. Then I'll keep working until it gets worse, Yagi said. He walked a few steps and threw the piece of coal into the furnace. The fire flared so bright and hot that Yagi had to raise his arms to momentarily shield himself from the heat. I didn't expect bad karma to burn this well. Sighing, Shota climbed back up on the platform. Why did you think hell's as hot as it is? Yagi turned to him. You've been to hell. No, but I believe this place is a close second. Meanwhile, Inko was pacing up and down in one of the bathrooms next to Midnight, slowly but surely wearing out the floorboards with her hooves. Over half a day had passed since Akatani had summoned Yagi. I know you're worrying about Yagi, Midnight said while kneeling on the floor, scrubbing a stain out of the wood. But I'm sure he'll be back. If Akatani wanted to kill him, he'd done so right away. Besides, Yagi is the golden dragon, isn't he? The greatest force of good this town has ever known. Sure, he's not as powerful as he used to be, but he's still got that goodness about him that's an inspiration for all of us. One day, we'll manage to usurp all rivers in one ourselves. It surprised Inko a little that Midnight knew, or rather, that Yagi couldn't have been any more wrong about people no longer recognizing him as All Might. In an attempt to take her mind off her worries, Inko picked up a wet cleaning rag and dropped it to the floor next to her fellow bathhouse worker. Midnight paused and watched her rub the rag against the boards with a hoof. It's pathetic, in a way, Inko knew, but what else was she to do? You know, you're quite the inspiration, too, Midnight remarked and chuckled at her. Inko felt her cheeks heat up a little. She didn't know what to say to that. Not that she could have said anything Midnight would have been able to understand. Her reaction evoked loud laughter from Midnight. Look at you. Getting flustered over a little praise. Inko huffed and nudged her with her head to get her to stop. All right, we'll keep working. Let's just get some fresh water first. Shota hadn't been kidding. Even though Yagi only picked up and chucked a piece of coal into the furnace whenever the flames began to die down, the stinging and burning of the coal and its dust on his skin remained. His fingers were already black from the coal, and additional stains had found its way on his haori, feet, legs and tail. There was water down in the basement, but all of it too hot to wash himself with. Assuming the black stuff could be washed off with water at all. From his small platform, Shota kept glancing over to him while sending and directing the paper streamers to the cabinet's drawers and back. He had made pretty clear what he thought of Yagi doing this work. Exhaustion was slowly creeping into Yagi's bones. His strength, little as it were, waned further. His side ached. It became harder to breathe. As he picked up another piece of coal and made the trip to the furnace again, all of a sudden, it felt like a latch was released and something previously coiled up unfurled. That something being Yagi's spirit form. He stumbled and fell because of the unexpected and undesired shift. "You're running out of energy," Shota said. His voice contained both a hint of concern and incredulity at Yagi's stubbornness. "It's time to stop this madness before it costs you your life." With some effort, Yagi picked himself back up and rose to all fours. He preferred being human, but if his body couldn't even afford to stay human, he'd just have to run around as a dragon. The point being that he wasn't about to give up just because of an involuntary shift. "It's okay. I'm still good to go," he said to Shota, trying to give his voice the kind of energy his body was lacking. "Don't be ridiculous. I saw you didn't shift on purpose." Yagi grabbed the piece of coal he'd lost when he'd stumbled with his front paw and threw it into the furnace. "See? I'm perfectly alright." He gave the boilerman a big grin. Shota shook his head in disapproval. It was painful to watch that old, emaciated dragon walk back and forth between the pile of coal and the furnace. Shota had hoped the moment he'd lost access to his human form would have been a strong enough warning sign for him to stop, but quite the opposite was the case. The weaker he got, the more focused he became on the completion of his task. Shota would have found it remarkable if it weren't for the fact that Yagi was killing himself with his own stubbornness. Gray and black splotches clung to his white fur and matted blonde mane. Before long, Yagi dragged himself from the furnace and back. The effort it took him was apparent, and since he was walking on all fours, he carried the coal in his mouth, which probably only accelerated how fast he was getting tainted. Yagi stumbled again, dropping the piece of coal, and Shota chose to take the risk and intervene. As he jumped off the platform, the streamers were immediately upon him and trying to drag him back up. Shota shook them off as best as he could, but where one let go, two more wrapped around his limbs. Fighting his way forward, he somehow managed to step into Yagi's way. "Stop it," he shouted at the dragon, who was unsteadily rising back to his feet. "You're not going to save anyone by dying." Before Yagi could snatch the coal with his jaws, Shota kicked it away. He received a threatening growl in response. Not a trace of fake cheerfulness was left in the eyes of the dragon. Their blue burned with a fearsome feral intensity. The glow of an ember that refused to die. Again, more streamers arrived to pull Shota out of Yagi's way. In the nick of time, he managed to bring a hand up as they tried to strangle him. It wasn't the first time Shota had fought the cursed paper figures. "Stop, Yagi. It's enough," he shouted. "Stop it." The dragon didn't listen. Once the paper had wrapped up Shota's legs and was successfully dragging him up into the air, Yagi went and got the coal and continued towards the furnace. If the taint from the bad karma didn't kill him, stumbling into the fire surely would. The paper cut into Shota's skin, drawing drops of blood as it tightened around his neck, yet he kept resisting. If Akatani wanted that dragon dead so badly, it was all the more reason for Shota to try and keep him alive. He was starting to run out of breath when a stroke of genius hit him. "Yagi. You did it. Do you hear me? You're done." Shota shouted with all the remaining air in his lungs. "Akatani wanted you to keep the fire lit till evening." "Right. Evening's here. You're done." Yagi paused mid-movement. There was no way to tell the time down in the basement since not a ray of sunlight reached into the boiler room. Shota had a rough idea of how much time had passed since Yagi arrived and knew that less than a whole day had passed, but he was hoping, begging, that Yagi had lost all concept of time in his weakness-induced days. "Nelly," Yagi dropped the coal. He was panting, likely close to collapsing. The cursed paper loosened a little, but still wouldn't let Shota free. "Go up." He kept shouting at Yagi. "Get back into the bathhouse. Find someone to help you." Using some kind of last reserve, Yagi dragged himself over to the staircase. Only after he'd slowly but successfully climbed the first steps, let the streamers Shota drop to his feet. He knew they'd be upon him again as soon as he took a single step out of the boiler room. He prayed dearly one of the upstairs workers would find Yagi quickly. Midnight and Inko were on their way from one bathroom to the next as Katsuki came running down the corridor towards them, looking agitated. "The snakes just left the bathhouse," he exclaimed. Where's Yagi?" "I don't know," Midnight replied. Last time I saw him he went to talk to Akatani. Fuck. He should be with you. Kitsuki raised his hands like he wanted to tear his hair out in frustration and turned to Inko. This is the only chance to save your brat. Before she could even properly process what Kitsuki had just said, screams resounded through the bathhouse. Midnight rolled her eyes at Kitsuki. What did you do? Me nothing. The hell you're thinking of me? There was another scream, a scream of pain mingled with the loud growl of a beast. The growl of a dragon, perhaps. Red-hot panic seized Inko's heart and lungs, but instead of freezing up, the fear for her loved ones ignited a fire within her. Before even Midnight or Kitsuki had moved, Inko did the one thing no real sheep would ever do. She ran towards the screams as fast as she could. Her pulse was pounding in her ears. Inko crossed the entrance hall of the bathhouse. The customers were all running into the opposite direction, forcing her to weave through them as best as she could. In their panicked flight, someone had spilled water all over the floor. Inko's hooves slipped. Tumbling out of the crowd, she crashed into the nearest wall. For a moment, everything went white. When she tried to push herself back up to keep running, her body coordination was completely off all of a sudden. Inko had to stumble and fall once more before she realized why her body felt so strange and yet so very familiar at the same time. She had hands again. And feet. And she was still, or rather, again wearing the jeans and the pink cardigan she had worn when she'd first arrived in the spirit realm. There wasn't any time for her to celebrate being a human again or to wonder what had caused her to turn back. She'd been stuck as a sheep for so long that it took her a few seconds to figure out how to run on two legs again. Precious time she lost rushing to Izuku's or Yagi's help. Whether as a sheep or human, Inko had never been particularly fit or fast. By the time she finally rounded the corner into the corridor the noises were coming from, she was panting from exertion. It took her a second to catch her breath, but as soon as she raised her head and laid eyes on the source of the commotion, her entire chest seized up. Yagi was there, in his skeletal dragon form, standing on top of Dabi. He had the fire demon pinned to the floor by keeping one of his arms down with a foreleg, while Dabi's other arm was firmly stuck between his jaws. Yet that alone wasn't what shocked Inko about that image. It was the blood that trickled out of Yagi's fangs from the demon's wounded arm and the way he was jerking his head back as if to try and tear the limb off, even though he was clearly lacking the strength. All the while, Dabi tried to kick at the scar on Yagi's chest, but his legs didn't quite reach. Let go of me. The demon yelled and huffed a cloud of smoke into Yagi's face, which only got him a snarl in response. That wasn't the awkward yet kind dragon Inko had gotten to know. Something was wrong with Yagi, and if she had to guess it had to do with the many, deep black soot stains all over his body and limbs. Not a shimmer of blue shone from his eyes. Yagi shivered with the effort it cost him just to keep Dabi down. How the hell are you even still alive? Dabi kept yelling at the dragon and tried to turn his head toward Inko. Tamura. Is that you? Don't just fucking stand there. Yagi. The sound of footfalls caused Inko to whirl around. Midnight and Kitsuki had caught up to her. Her eyes met those of the salamander boy. Inko? Kitsuki. Inko nearly startled herself with being able to form whole words again. Damn. He's badly tainted, Midnight said, staring at Yagi. Let go of Dabi. He didn't hurt anyone. She lowered her voice a little. Not recently, at least. You're not helping, Midnight. Dabi yelled back. You know what would help? If you stopped resisting. I don't want my fucking arm torn off by some blunt-toothed rotting spirit. Somehow, Inko found the courage to take a step forward. Yagi. It's me. I'm okay. Although there was no reaction from him, Midnight kept trying. Listen, Yagi, Inko's alright. She's fine. Finally, the dragon stopped moving and Dabi managed to turn his head far enough to establish eye contact with Midnight. She signaled him to stay down. Inko could hear Yagi panting heavily through his teeth and the arm stuck in between. Let us get that taint off you and you can go back to protecting us, Midnight added. It took a lot of coaxing to get Yagi off of Dabi. When he finally let go of the demon's arm and took an unsteady step forward, Dabi thankfully remained still. Yagi was far from okay. While walking, he kept stumbling into the walls on either side of the corridor. Where he'd left black smears of soot on the wall panels, the wood immediately began to rot and decay. Let him down the hallway and into the first room on the left side, Midnight instructed Inko. I'll prepare the water. If we don't purify him quickly, he's dead. She ran ahead and disappeared around the corner. Meanwhile, Dabi was slowly rising from the floor. For someone who just had his arm gnawed on by a dragon, he didn't seem to be in a whole lot of pain. You will not purify him, he said menacingly. Behind him, Akatani's messenger boy had arrived at the scene. Tamura. Get Toga and the others. We've got to stop them. Another growl caught Inko's attention, but it was more of a human growl, and it came from Kitsuki. Over my dead body. The boy shouted and ran at Dabi. Kitsuki. Small explosions burst from the orange spots on his skin, driving the fire demon back. "Don't worry about me," he yelled back at her. "Keep going. I'll hold him off. He's had it coming, anyway. Stupid fucking brat. Get off of me." While the sounds of their scuffle faded into the background, Yagi kept dragging himself further down the corridor, and Inko tried to urge him to continue by placing a hand on a still white spot in his shoulder. He didn't seem aware of her presence or anything that was going on around him, really. The fear that he'd just break down and fade away held her heart in an iron grip. When they finally made it to the room Midnight had run ahead to, reinforcements for Dobby arrived. A girl with spider legs sticking out of her blonde hair rushed towards them, holding a knife in each hand. "Midnight!" Inko screamed, about to panic. The other woman came running, but before she made it over to Inko, a long pink tongue wrapped around the blonde girl's ankle and pulled her to the floor. The frog girl Tsu stood at the end of the hallway, along with some of the other bathhouse children. "Mr. Yagi needs our help," she exclaimed. A dark mist suddenly gathered next to Inko. She urged Yagi through the door while Midnight stepped up and tore off one of her sleeves. The fine, white dust spread from her skin. "Nighty-night, Kuro," she exclaimed, laughing, yet more of Akatani's henchmen were already on their way. Midnight turned to Inko. "Leave this to us," she said. "I'm counting on you to save him." For a second, Inko was dumbstruck. She knew a purification ritual could restore a spirit's energy, but she wasn't the most religious type and not quite sure what she was meant to do besides trying to scrub off that black soot. Before she could ask, Midnight had run off to face another bathhouse worker wearing a mask, and there was no time to chase her down again. Inko entered the bathroom and closed the door behind her, just in time to see Yagi collapse into the stone tub with a big splash. Coincidentally, it was the very same stone tub Dobby had made them clean on their first day of work. Although Midnight had only been carrying cleaning tokens around with her, she'd somehow gotten a strongly scented infusion from the boiler room. She grabbed one of the brushes that were lying around and approached Yagi, whose head hung just barely over the edge of the tub. He was wheezing. His breath came in short bursts. When Inko placed a hand on his cheek, she could feel the shivers running through him, but he didn't react to her touch, having lost consciousness. So, Inko did the only thing she could do, climbed into the hot water and set to work. The soot or whatever it was didn't come off easily, but once it did, it dispersed in the water. She kept scrubbing diligently at each black and gray spot until his fur and scales regained their original pristine white and sunshine yellow color while slowly making her way from head to tail. Inko tried to be especially mindful of the scar tissue around his left side but couldn't afford to lose much time as long as he wasn't showing any signs of recovery. Every once in a while, sounds of the fighting going on outside reached her ears, but Inko did her best to ignore it. She had to trust Midnight and the children to handle Akatani's henchmen. At the very least, all of them had spirit powers and magical abilities. Inko didn't. By the time she had removed the last black stain, Inko was completely soaked and slightly exhausted. From what she could tell, Yagi's breathing had calmed and the shivers had stopped, but he remained unconscious. A sign that could be read as either good or very, very bad. Inko subdued her growing worries and resolved to keep trying. Once she had discarded her soaked cardigan and water-filled shoes, she pulled up her sleeves and set about to brush the countless knots and tangles out of the dragon's hair. While she worked in the opposite direction, life slowly returned to his body. A twitch of a muscle here, a flex of a claw there, a flick of his ear. When Inko finally reached his head again, she let a bit of water drip from the cup of her hand onto his snout and carefully removed the last trace of Dobby's blood. She was so focused on her task that she nearly suffered a heart attack as her eyes suddenly met Yagi's. He was awake. "I must be dreaming," he said. "You've turned back. You're so pretty." Inko figured he must still be hazy because first of all, he said it with all the innocence of a child who had no clue what that kind of compliment could do to a woman, and secondly, she really didn't consider herself pretty, just single mom nearing 40 standard at best. "Did the snake turn you back?" Yagi kept asking and shifted in the stone tub so he could lift his head off the edge. Because if he did a poor job. "Ah, no. It just sort of happened. Make that sheep mom nearing 40 standard, actually." Inko brought up a hand to feel her ear because when she'd taken an accidental dip in the water earlier, her ears had come up far too heavy and that's how she'd found out that she still had sheep ears. Her hair also still had a woolly quality and was a much lighter shade of green than it should be. Yagi smiled at her. "I'm still happy for you." The sound of an explosion caused him to perk up his ears. "What's going on outside?" "Midnight and the kids are holding off Akatani's henchmen until you've recovered." He got up in alarm. "Wait, what?" "They're doing good. Akatani isn't here to step in. He's left. Then we have to go get Izuku now." Inko motioned for him to stay in the tub, but there was no stopping the dragon from climbing over the edge. "Are you even well enough to do this? Can you shift?" He shook out his mane. Can I shift? Thanks to you, I can do something much better than that. Yagi raised his head high, standing proudly and positively brimming with confidence. Hop on. Wait, did he mean to? A few seconds later, Yagi burst out of the room with Inko on his shoulders and hugging his neck. As he ran past the bathhouse workers, cheers broke out among them. Katsuki led the chorus. All might. He shouted. Go save that boy. Get them home. Abi, having learned his lesson, jumped out of the way as he saw Yagi careering towards him at full speed. Where the dragon was headed became only clear when he turned into a room with an open balcony door. There was no sign of him slowing down. Yagi? Inko cried in fear for their lives. He jumped over the railing. That's it for today guys, hope you all enjoyed this video. If you do, consider leaving a like, share and subscribe. And don't forget to check out the author of this story. All details in description. Thanks for watching, take care.